everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Reborn is the first Nephilim chapter 51 to 60. Chapter 47 Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. It was a simple matter to explain what a Dryasdal Dryad was to the two former Gotham residents. In short, it was simply taking part of Ivy's current body, the Dryas tree, and making something in the shape of a humanoid body out of it. Once that was done, Lucian would use Puriel's ability, Over Souls, to help facilitate the shift of her soul's primary home into the wooden doll. It turned out that he didn't need to make a chaos core like Rimuru did, as that was more to improve upon the Dryad's power rather than something needed to achieve the change in status into a Dryasdal Dryad. So, in all, I just need you to either give me some wood from your tree, or for you to make something out of wood yourself in order to serve as your new body, the Nephilim told them as he finished the explanation. The two women looked at each other before turning back to the silver-haired man. And there's no risks of any kind in doing this? Harley asked, concern for her partner evident in her words. Lucian shook his head and assured them of the safety of the procedure. If one could call it, I can assure you that it will be 100% safe, he told them with utter sincerity. Lucian was in possession of an ultimate skill with the title Lord of Souls after all. Couldn't do something as simple as moving a willing soul into a new vessel, one that's a spiritual being at that, then he didn't know who could. That wasn't meant as a boastful thought either. Ultimate skills are meant to be the pinnacle of their respective skills, so Puriel, as one that had power over souls, should more than be able to do something like this. It is but a trivial matter for me to accomplish something this simple, Puriel themselves said, almost as if insulted somewhat at the doubt that Harley had for their skill in such a. Lucian smiled at that, glad to see his skill refer to themselves like that when speaking. Boded well for what would come, and their development of an ego. Regardless, he focused back on the two before him. All right, Ivy said, seeming to sigh out as she did so. Lucian noted, however, that her reaction came only after Harley seemed to give her a nod, subtle though it was. After that, though, Ivy seemed to gesture with her hand towards her tree. At first he thought it to maybe be some form of invitation, but that was soon proven wrong as Ivy moved her hand forward in a sweeping motion. As she did so, the ground seemed to be displaced in a straight line until it reached in front of the green woman. Once the shifted earth reached her, a large root burst from the ground. In short order, the roots that Ivy seemed to have summoned forth grew and took shape. Only moments for a wooden doll to be grown from the roots, looking like a perfect replica of Ivy in shape and size. Then, with another sigh, the plant mistress broke off the thin wood that connected the doll to the roots in order to separate the new construct. Will this do then? She asked as she pushed a strand of her red hair back behind her ear. The Nephilim was a bit surprised at the ease in which Ivy made such a complex creation out of her own tree roots. From what he'd read back in the guild library, Dryads did not have such fine control over plants like that. It was supposed to be like one guided the plants into shape, while Ivy's control was more direct and controlled. The detail of the doll was impressive to say the least, matching her proportions exactly. In essence, this wasn't a blank canvas that could be used for anyone like what Rimuru would one day use, but more a custom-made vessel. This will more than do, Ivy. To be honest, I wasn't expecting something so detailed, he told her, not bothering to hide how impressed he was with the degree of control she held over the botanist. Seemed to smile slightly at that, as if taking pride in her work. Lucian then walked up to her and gave her a smile in assurance. Ivy nodded and seemed to surrender to the slight pull she felt Lucian give off, resulting in her form turning into motes of light. Green light gathered in the Nephilim's hand, and he quickly pushed it into the doll that was now laying down on the grass. With some aid from Puriel, the process went smoothly, and the wooden appearance of the doll vanished as it was replaced with familiar green skin. Harley wasted no time after her girlfriend sat up and hugged the redhead. Ivy simply smiled and patted the back of her lover, having long gotten used to the blatant displays of affection the pale woman showed her. Now we should be able to go wherever. Red. Maybe we can go shopping and get you some proper clothes, she said, giving the other woman a shit-eating grin at the mention of Ivy. Flushed at that, seeming a bit embarrassed at that for some reason. It took Lucian a second to understand why, but it soon hit him. Don't really know how to make your form appear with clothes well, do you? Asked, a small smile on his face from how Ivy pointedly didn't look in his direction. He laughed at that, finding it somewhat humorous. It made sense though, she was new to having to make a false body as it were, so it probably took all her current experience to make what little covering she had previously. That made how she appeared to them make a lot more sense. She wore so little not because she was some kind of nudist, but because she didn't know how to make her form have more clothes. Shaking his head, he decided that he would ask the two of them if they'd like some clothes. He could use material creation to whip them up something easily enough, he would just need their sizes. Though he knew that asking that would be awkward. Maybe I'll have Kushina bring it up with them instead. He thought to himself, not wanting to offend his new companions. A bit of time had passed after Lucian transferred Ivy's soul into her new body. The group of 5 had since left the clearing and headed deeper into the woods. Currently they were resting at the campsite they had made for the night. The 2 new additions now wore some new clothing reminiscent of what the 2 wore in the Harley Quinn animated series that Lucian made for them. Strangely enough, despite the clothing designs coming from the 2, they didn't seem to be from that universe. Over the past few days they had talked more about their interaction with the DC universe, and it honestly didn't tell him much about which one it was. It seemed that they were from a point in time that was early on in the DC timeline. Reason he could determine that was the fact that when he asked how many Robins there had been, the 2 looked at him with utter confusion. In their words, there was only one Robin, and it had been only a few years since the boy wonder showed up. That told him that Richard Grayson was still Robin, and that made it clear that much of the crazier bullshit hadn't happened yet in their universe. The fact that neither knew who Darkseid was also made that clear. It was pretty rare for anything too crazy to have happened yet if they knew nothing of the likes of Darkseid, Doomsday, Trigon, or any of those big bads that he listed off in order to see what kind of world they were from. Lucian then having to explain what those people were, and the threat they posed was a bit fun though in a cathartic way. To be honest, he was just kind of glad that he wasn't the only one suffering from knowing such beings existed out there. Regardless, in that time they had discussed more than just how the 2 new members' universe was like. Lucian and Kushina told them more about their own realities, with Lucian also going into more depth on the world they were currently in. That included an overview of different races, skills, and the major factions in play. He even gave the 2 some copies of books that he'd read in the library on the official history of the world made with the help of. After hearing about all that, the 2 Gothamites disclosed their own skills that they gained in the transfer between worlds. In their own words, it only made sense in case they got into another fight. Ivy, besides the ones from turning into a dryad, had received some pretty good skills, like magic sense, earth manipulation, and poison nullification. However, what was the best out of what she gained was her unique skill, Gardener. This skill took in her new intrinsic skill, Plant Whisper, and made it into something far greater. With Gardener, Ivy could grow, alter, control, and sense through plants within a large area around herself. Through the use of this skill, she could do things like make plant golems or superfoods. With the introduction of magicules and their properties when affecting plants, Ivy could now even make magical that opened the possibility for a whole lot of things. Just off the top of Lucian's head, things like stronger forms of hypocute plants, or poisons, that could make the primordial violet envious were things that she could possibly make. Not to mention how beneficial to agriculture she could be with such a skill. Harley, on the other hand, had some interesting skills herself. This included a few common and extra skills like strength and body, and one he'd never seen before called flexibility, the latter making Harley more flexible as the name implied. She also had magic sense that she seemed to have gained on her own. Her unique skill though was quite the skill though. Was called psychologist, and it was created from her skills in the field. The skill let her read the others with supernatural skill, being able to tell what someone was feeling and even if they were lying. In combat it also let her predict the next moves of her opponent. All of that though grew more accurate and more detailed the more she knew about someone. As she put it, the more fleshed out the psychological profile, she had on someone the more she could predict and sense. The skill also granted her thought acceleration as a sub-skill, allowing her even more time to try and predict or read someone. With that in mind, Lucian now understood why Ivy was so calm about him transferring her soul over after Harley's nod. That had been the former gymnast's signal that he was telling the truth about how risky it. Unsurprisingly, Harley also had some resistance skills. That included pain resistance, poison resistance, and spiritual attack resistance. That last skill seemingly came from her desire to never fall under the Joker's control ever again, being a skill that resisted mental attacks like mind control. In short, she was a quite frankly terrifying opponent in the right circumstances with that skill set. She was capable of predicting her opponent's moves and attacking in unorthodox ways with her increased flexibility. The only thing she was lacking was raw power, and that was something that would come in time, Lucian was sure. The Nephilim had also gained some new skills himself after the fight with the Leshy. Included the photosynthesis skill that the deer creatures had, as some of them sadly died in the crossfire. That skill, however, was quite the intriguing thing though, as it was an energy conversion skill at its core. The idea that one type of energy, in this case sunlight, could be turned into magicules opened up some avenues of thought for him. Mainly about possibly turning magicules into other types of energy, and the applications of such a thing. That all was ideas for later though. For now, he would continue his journey in preparation for what was to some of those preparations, may just include a few more names being given out, he thought, while looking at Ivy from across the campsite. Guy sat back as he listened to the report the Misery was giving him. In the past year he'd heard more interesting reports than the last 5 combined, and he wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of him was glad that one of those of his lineage was doing something that helped alleviate his boredom, while another was on edge at the events that were likely to take whenever a new demon lord was close to being born, especially a true one. He grew not due to any feelings of being threatened, mind you, but more so he didn't want there to be anything that made him act on his role as mediator. Some may think that he was premature for thinking a true demon lord was to be born. Call those people fools. Guy had been alive since the dawn of time, literally, and held the role of mediator for longer than every nation in the world had existed. The demon had seen dozens of demon lords come into existence, and most did not play well with the order he'd helped establish. For a time though he hadn't needed to intervene personally due to how that hero called all the unruly ones. Cronoa was the name they went by if he remembered right. Regardless, he now had to consider if this was something he needed to intervene in. Deaths of so many, as according to his green maid there were close to 25,000. Total troops, though not all human, would cause ripples to form in the world. Guy had no doubt that at the least over half that number would die, leading to a harvest festival. Would happen after the festival that he wondered if action needed to be taken. And that ends the report on the forces that the Kingdom of Malstans has amassed. Seems that they are using slaves and conscripted citizens to help pad out their numbers. What my sources have found out, the new king is wanting to absolutely crush the Magian known as Lucian with sheer numbers, and is somewhat wary at their status as a Nephilim, due to not knowing the power of such a race. Misery finished her report with a bow. Well, I can't blame them really. Even one, as I haven't heard of such a creature before, so a pathetic human nation being wary is only logical, the primordial of Red said, finding it only natural that a race as weak and illogical as humans would fear the unknown so much. Besides, this Lucian character was descended from him despite his different race, so of course they should be scared. I feel perhaps they may be overreacting in this matter. After all, there are so few true foes for them to fight. It's highly illogical. Velzard spoke from her position to his right, voice holding nothing but dismissiveness for the humans. He chuckled at his partner's words, not fully disagreeing with her. Yes, but humans are an illogical sort when confronted with fear. And fearing one that is of my line is only right, he told her, getting a nod from the true dragon at that. No member of his line was weak after all, he'd made sure of it. It was a point of pride for him, and this newcomer was only proving to be an addition he could be proud of. Hopefully after awakening Lucian would decide to play ball and seek out the council. Guy laughed at the Thoughts that came to mind on how such an addition to the council might go. Maybe I should call Leon for a chat soon. It's always a good time to tease that stick in the mud after all, he thought to himself before dismissing his two maids. Velzard walked off after that, no longer interested in what was going on and knowing that her oblivious partner would get lost in his thoughts after the information they heard. She sighed and wondered the thought that had stuck with her for thousands of years now. When would that silly man finally notice her feelings? It was starting to get infuriating. She may have the ultimate skill for the virtue of patience, but even she was soon to run out of it. The fact that Tagalong agreed with thoughts such as that didn't help, to be honest. It was times like this that she envied her sister. At least Velgrind knew where she stood with those thoughts usually soon turned to pity and sadness when thinking about the state of her sister's lover. The Emperor of the East was losing himself more and more with each reincarnation. At this point few things were holding him together, the game that he and Guy played being one of those anchors. The Ice Dragon knew that her partner was worried about their friend. It was part of the reason he even entertained having Demon Lord seeds on the council. The added numbers and governed territory was a good piece to have on the board. The game more interesting, or at least that's how Guy put it. All these thoughts though were making her mood sour even more. The winds picked up with her shifting mood, making her collect herself before the blizzard that formed from her grew too intense. Maybe it was time to go see those penguin-like creatures that had taken to living here, on her icy land once, that always served to cheer her up. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 52. Chapter 48. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The mummified form of their foe launched a ball of necrotic energy at Ivy before Harley hit the bastard with her bat. Sadly, the bat began to rot after the blow, though it did send the undead back a few paces. Ivy summoned a wall of tree roots just in time to block the energy blast, thankfully. With a quick look, Lucian could tell that this wasn't a good matchup for the green woman though. The nearly falling apart form of her wall after taking that blast showed this all started about 10 minutes ago when the group of 5 had been looking for a place to set up camp. The party had been trekking through the woods of the great forest of Jura for a while now, several days in fact. So they had thought everything was well enough in the spot they were looking at, and judging how viable it was for a temporary campground was near the edge of the territory of the lizard men known as Lake Sis. No encampment of the scaled people were in the area though, instead it was mostly swampy marshland as far as they could tell. Lucian had only come this way in hopes of finding some hostile semi-aquatic monsters for some new skills. That had bore no fruit however, instead they now faced this undead monster. It rose from the murky water like something out of a horror movie, a dried husk of what was presumably a human. With a quick scan of his trusty ultimate skill he found out this thing was a bog mummy. Bog mummies were a subspecies of undead that came into existence when a human full of anger dies, and then their body is mummified through natural means. They weren't fairly rare nor common in parts like these. The Nephilim's first instinct was to burn the creature and be done with it. The thing was undead after all, so fire was a natural weakness of theirs. Puriel warned him not to though, for there was a thin amount of methane over the swamp that came from the many bodies that lay beneath the water. A single spark and everyone would be blown sky high. Information. Lucian was quick to put together what exactly they'd stumbled across, a former battleground. It seemed likely that with the presence of so many bodies, this being a border area, and the lack of any lizard men, that this was a former battlefield where a group of humans and lizard men fought. The ones who lived here in the past likely saw no reason to bury the dead humans, what with the bog taking them in, thus leading to this situation. To be honest, after putting that together, Lucian was just glad that they only had the one to deal with. Rissisi, a ghastly voice came from the mummy seemingly in response to Lucian's. From the swampy water over 15 more of the monsters rose from the water at their apparent leader's command. Lucian felt like hitting his head against the wall at the sight. Cursing himself for tempting Murphy. With a sigh he used material creation to make a metal bat that he then enhanced with yang manipulation before troughing it to Harley. It looks like they make anything organic rot or decompose on contact, so use this instead, he told the woman with a Brooklyn accent when she looked at him for an explanation after catching the bat. Then I'll use this baby to hit a home run with their heads. Harley shouted out with a slightly manic laugh before trying to do just that with the nearest undead. Kushina then took that as a signal to send out her chains to entrap and stab through some more of the undead. She was limited right now on how many chains she could make, only 9 in total, but it more than occupied a good few mummies. Ivy chose to stay back after a look from Lucian and remembering his words about the creatures did to anything organic. Instead she'd guard Historia, the beast still lacking much in the way of combat skill. Nephilim gave her a grateful nod before drawing Graham from his pocket space. With an application of his aura he burst forward and cut the arm off a mummy that was poised to attack Harley from her blind spot. She noticed his actions and gave him a smile and gratitude before going back to batting practice. Lucian just smirked and went on to cut through all the mummies on his side, Graham seeming to sing in his hands with each swing. After that it was only about half an hour more to kill them all or re-kill them as it were. They were only taking so long due to how they kept attacking through their injuries, but they eventually fell once they ran out of the necrotic energy keeping them together. Well, I don't know about you all, but I'm kind of done with this forest, Lucian said to them all after they all caught their breath. After getting a round of nods in return, it was soon decided that once morning came, they were going to leave this forest. It had been a little over 2 months since he'd declared war on Malstance after all. It was time to regroup, he felt. Plus, Lucian wanted to know more about what was going on with the Tengu situation that Alex had told him about. It had been a while since Alex watched as the Tengu envoy party left, flying higher into the mountains to their village. The meeting with them had gone well, they felt, with the exception of how on edge the winged men were the whole time. It made sense to the demon though, to have such strong people come out of nowhere was a shock. Since then they had taken care of the rescued slaves and tended to their needs. A few more rescue operations had taken place as well, mainly in the form of former battle slaves and bed slaves. It was deemed that these two groups of slaves were at the highest risk of permanent and severe harm, be it physical or psychological. When Alex's sire had told them about the psychologist that was now among their number, and explaining what that was, they were incredibly relieved. For it was clear that all these people would need therapy of some kind, a type of help they just weren't suited for. The fact that kids had been in the groups they rescued only made them angrier than before, and they knew that their anger would not help any of these poor souls in healing. Other than the slave rescue efforts, Alex had collected more information from their place perched on their web. The demon had found out more dirt on the nobility, and the plans that the king was making for the upcoming conflict. This included how much of the king's soldiers came from his vassals, and they were only able to get them through a ton of political maneuvering. Tax breaks, land grants from land that originally belonged to the royal family, and good old-fashioned blackmail were used by the young king to secure troops. He'd even promised his hand in marriage to one of his vassals' daughters who had the most troops. From what Alex heard, they planned the wedding to take place after the war was won. The demon was just glad the lady wouldn't be a widow then, with that the blackmail had been of particular interest to Alex though. Collecting dirt and leverage on all those in power was crucial for what came after the war that they knew. Information it would allow Blake to hold the unruly characters who survived this war by the preverbal balls. That would make them keep in line until such a time that they could get rid of any who were still intent on causing problems. For after this war of swords and steel was won, one of shadows and assassins would begin in order to pave the way for a better nation under their uncle's rule. Now though, Alex walked among the fledgling community that had been raised on the mountainside. A smile came to their face at the view, one that was tempered once they saw the winged man standing against the main building that Alex called his own. That man was a member of the Tengu clan that had stayed behind. As part of the discussion the two groups had, it was decided that a member of the clan would stay here in the community to wait for Alex's sire. The demon had obviously informed Lucian of this development, and he'd okayed, but both of them knew that waiting for Lucian's arrival wasn't the only thing they were doing by staying here. No, the Tengu was here to keep an eye on them and their actions. Whether to gauge their character or their strength was unclear, perhaps both. Regardless, it was the agreement the two sides had come to that when Lucian arrived the Tengu Watcher would leave to alert their chief. And the two leaders would then have a talk on the situation moving forward. Alex wasn't sure how that would go, and part of them dreaded the thought of possible conflict with the clan. Another war so close to the one they were already preparing for was not something they. As the gray-haired spy walked closer to the building's entrance, they suddenly got a thought communication. "All right, everyone, it's time to regroup. The mountainside where Alex and Surtur are is the rendezvous point. It's time we started our final preparations," the voice of their sire said directly into their mind. Alex smiled at that and put a hand on the watching Tengu's shoulder as they passed. "He's coming," was all they said to the man. It took him a couple of moments to comprehend those words, but once he did, the man took off in flight to report to the chief. Alex just chuckled a little bit, finding an odd sense of bemusement from being so cryptic and obtuse. Blake packed up his gear into his spatial storage, having received the same message as the. It was time. Soon enough he'd be walking out onto a battlefield, and after that he'd be taking the role of king. The young man's hands shook slightly from the nerves that thought brought him, only to find the small form of his lion-like companion forcing him to pet them. Blake laughed at that, finding the space elemental to be a mischievous little guy ever since they'd bonded. The mini-lion was named Leo, after the constellation as he'd found it fitting. Plus Blake wasn't that good at names, to be honest. Regardless, he started petting the elemental and found himself calming down. He was glad Leo was there to help him like this, even taking on their smaller form to be more comforting. After being named, Leo now had a larger form that was his true form, a large lion that was taller than Blake himself was. That increased size and ability to make spatial shockwaves with his roar made the newest addition to Blake's group a good combatant, to say the least. "You'll do fine, child," the soothing voice of Hikari said to him, as she appeared in a flash. Of course he will. "We chose him for a reason after all," the more gruff voice of Yami said, after his fellow elemental. Blake smiled, glad to have so much support in his life now. Before it was really only Gramps. Back in the village, and later Lucian. Now though he had so many to help him, to guide him and stand by him. From Shizu and Lucian's spawn, to the trio of elementals that he now called partners. It was a wonderful feeling to the young man, something he'd never thought himself able to have. So, with a more determined face, he stood up the elementals, feeling his renewed determination, and going back to the space near his soul. "It's time. I got this," he said to himself before going to find Ramiris. It was a short walk until he found the elemental queen. She was fiddling with one of her golems, tongue sticking out as she focused, making for a cute sight. Due to her child-sized, Blake cleared his throat to get her attention, as he'd learned how absorbed she could get in her work. Sure enough, the blonde fairy turned her head towards him at the sound, only now noticing him. "Oh, it's you, Blake. What did you want?" Ramiris asked him once she focused on the teen. "I'm here to say goodbye and thank you one more time before heading off. My brother has called and let me know it's time," the redhead told her before giving a bow of thanks. Ramiris seemed like she didn't know how to respond and remained silent at that. Taking that as his cue to leave, Blake turned around and made to leave. He stopped, however, as the small fairy finally spoke, turning his head to look at her as she spoke. "Blake, you have the makings of a hero. I should know. You'll do great things, I'm sure," she told him, a sincere look on her face as she gave him those words of encouragement. He stood there for a moment, thankfulness swelling in his heart at the fairy's words. Moved on though at her hand shooing him away, off to fulfill the destiny he'd forged for. "Off you go, don't keep your brother waiting," were the words she said to him as she motioned for him to go on, a smile on her face, and in her words. Alice finished saying her goodbyes to the headmaster, having returned all her books and leaving this as the last thing she needed to do before heading off. After getting the word that it was time to come back, she'd wasted no time in getting everything squared away for her and Bullet's departure. The demon took care of everything relating to the Magic Academy, while the muscled mountain of a man took care of everything regarding their accommodations. Now all that was left was for her to meet the big lug at the city gate. As she walked that way, a smile was on her face, excitement bleeding through. She had enjoyed her time in this city, and in the academy, learning magic and studying but she was more than ready to meet back up with her family. Alice couldn't wait to show off all that she'd accomplished to her sire, and use it to whip the floor with Alfred in their next spar. It had taken her many sleepless nights to perfect everything, and she was anticipating great praise from Lucian at what she'd made. Bullet was waiting for her though, so she picked up the pace. In no time she saw him and waved to him. She got a wave back and soon was but a few feet in front of the man. The warrior a high-fived the two, then headed out for where her youngest brother had set up. "You ready for what's to come, little lady?" Bullet asked her, the grin on his face showing that he knew the answer to that question before it even left his lips. "Of course." The black-haired witch shouted out with a fist pump up into the air, getting a chuckle from the military man. He just hoped that excitement and energy wouldn't diminish after the blood that would soon flow. For he knew war, and he knew what it did to people. "Though, I have seen some of her notes on magic spells." Bullet thought and shook himself from the memories. To say that he was glad she was on his side after seeing the notes on acid spells was an understatement. Alfred dusted the sand off his clothes once more, frustrated at the small grains. Shirzwa had received the call to regroup, and had made their way out of the desert area. With now they were walking through a more forested area, and he was still getting sand out of his clothes. Shirzwa wasn't faring much better but was less frustrated at the whole experience. In the blonde man's words, he'd been to the beach before, so he was used to such. The white-haired demon envied his friend in this instance, wishing he was more used to the sand like him, so he'd stop being so itchy. Despite that though, Alfred was happy. He'd soon get to see the others and see how much they'd grown. The battle maniac was looking forward to all the good fights he'd soon be able, though he knew that first they'd have to take care of Malstance. He was looking forward to seeing some more action, but a part of him told him that he wouldn't see much, and his sire was taking this seriously after all, and Alfred had no doubt that with Lucian getting serious that victory was all but guaranteed. His time would come though, that Alfred was sure of. The warrior spirit inside him burned brightly at the thought of further challenges, further opportunities to grow stronger. With this in mind that he decided to try and spice up the trip back to the others. "Hey Shirzwa," he started, a grin on his face as he looked at his thug-looking friend. The former bartender asked him with a questioning look. "Race you to the mountain?" Alfred asked him, getting a matching grin in response from the blonde before Shirzwa took off. "That's cheating," the demon shouted as he picked up his pace, laughing all the while. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter End Notes: I have a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 53, Chapter 49. Chapter notes: see the end of the chapter for notes. It had taken them all a week to reach the small mountainside settlement that Alex had set up. The first to arrive was Blake and his elemental partners, the young men getting wary looks from the freed slaves before Alex assured them of who he was. Finding out he was a friend made them all relax greatly. In the following days, the redhead got to know the people his brother's spawn had freed, lending a sympathetic ear and his help with the heavy labor tasks as best he could. It didn't take long for the populace to grow fond of him, fellow builders patting him on the back and the elders pinching his cheeks. Alice and Bullet were next to arrive. The entrance to the settlement met with similar wariness. When Alex called the female mage sister, though they all became more friendly towards the Alice had since helped out by healing minor wounds that workers and the like got, her healing magic much more practical to use than the limited if vast supply of potions they had. Bullet had joined in with Blake on helping out the laborers as well as taking on an instructor-like role for those that wished to learn self-defense. His experience leading men in the military helped him out greatly there. After those two, Alfred and Schurzwa showed up the next day. The freedmen were less wary this time, though still on guard when the two showed up. Alf punching Blake on sight and challenging him to a spar didn't help much at first, though the laughter that the two young men had in their voices after that eased their worries. Schurzwa had won their little race, the white-haired demon telling everyone that the blonde had cheated whenever the topic got brought up. Though the smile and lack of heat in his voice when he said it revealed how little he was actually upset about it. It was on the 7th day though that Lucian and his large group showed up. Having decided to put on a bit of a show, the Nephilim decided to let his wings out for his first appearance. His white bat-like wings drew the attention of the freedmen, more so than Ivy's green complexion even. They had all been told by the one who freed them that they were a subordinate to a Nephilim, though they had no frame of reference for what that was really. Yet, each of them instantly knew that this was what one looked like. The presence was both demonic and holy at the same time, fitting for the fusion of angel and demon that he was. Many felt something come from the man, an aura of comfort that was unexpected that softened the feeling of his power on them all. That was due to Lucian asking Puriel to utilize his hockey skill to impart a feeling of comfort and safety instead of fear. He hoped that this would ease any tension that the populace may have, well aware that they had been through a great deal. It seemed to have worked, as the people didn't regard him and his group with the same wariness as they had the others, a combination of the aura and the knowledge that this was likely their savior's lord and father. The rest of Lucian's ragtag group came out to meet him after feeling the familiar presence, Alex taking the lead. "Welcome, sire, to this humble settlement. I hope that I have done things to your satisfaction," Alex said as they bowed at the hip, deciding to take some of what he'd seen others do when in the presence of a noble. The others followed suit as they greeted Lucian as well, having spoken of this with Alex beforehand. It was deemed the right course of action in order to show the others the amount of respect that they held for Lucian, as well as a subtle showing of the hierarchy as it were. Though none of them bowed against their will, they all respected him far more than most respected their nobles after all. To them it only made sense to do something like this. Blake was the only one not to bow, instead stepping out from the line the group had stood in, and taking Lucian into a hug. This was also predetermined by them all without Lucian's knowledge in order to show that Blake was more of an equal to him. That would only help in their future plans, despite the young man's distaste for such political moves. Lucian went along with it all smoothly, having put together this was all being done for a reason. Breaking from the hug with his brother, he addressed them all. "This is wonderful work, I assure you. You have done well in aiding the people and upholding the values we hold," he told Alex while speaking loud enough for all in the settlement to hear. The murmurs of the crowd were positive from what he caught, making Lucian fully understand the reasoning for this display. With a nod of his head though, he asked for them to go speak in private. Alex and the others stood up from their bow, and the spider-like demon led them inside the building that served as their home and office. Once behind closed doors, the group began to greet each other more jovially with hugs and gentle teasing. Lucian even jokingly asked Bullet how many explosions his little Alice had caused while they were away. It was with good cheer that they all caught up with one another, Lucian also taking the time to introduce the new additions to their number. Eventually though, things settled down and serious conversation took over. Once Lucian asked them all to listen as he told them something serious, the group quieted down quickly. A light Puriel put up the barrier, he told, the ultimate skill. With a flash of magic, a barrier now covered them all, its field of effect being small enough to only cover the room they were in. This barrier was made by Puriel at Lucian's request to specifically keep all sound from within the barrier from escaping. A privacy barrier of sorts. Blake looked at his brother in confusion, unsure what was so serious he was taking such a precaution. The others weren't much better than the redhead, to be honest. "All right, what I'm about to tell you all cannot leave this room. I initially didn't want to tell you all, but circumstances have changed. Now the potential existential crisis is no longer good enough a reason to keep this from you, if it ever was. Lucian began, getting odd looks from all those not in the know. Over the next few hours he went over all the information he had regarding things such as his omniverse theory, his knowledge of this world from his previous one, and the fact that he knew both Shurzwa and Bulat from similar media. It was a long discussion where he went over all that he knew of the two's worlds, and what he knew of this one. From the one behind the angelic invasions Michael, to the angel that aims to destroy the world Feldway and everything else he could think of in that moment. To say that the others were surprised was a bit of an understatement, and the silence that followed was proof of that. Eventually though the silence was broken by Alfred, surprisingly. So you're saying that, according to this theory, that there could potentially be other versions, the white-haired demon asked. Yes, that is technically a possibility considering everything, Lucian answered, not quite sure where his spawn was going with that question. Alfred then punched his fist into his palm, and had a big grin on his face. Then that means I could maybe spar against myself one day. So I'll just have to be the strongest me in the Omniverse. He shouted out, seeming more pumped up at the possible challenge than facing any kind of crisis like Lucian had feared. At first the silence returned at the man's outburst. That didn't last long though before everyone started to laugh, the tension breaking at Alfred's enthusiasm at being able to potentially fight a different version of himself. Lucian looked around and was glad to see that no one seemed to be struggling with the reveal like he'd been expecting. It was a surprise but not an unwelcome one. Once the laughter died down though he asked the question he had to ask though. So none of you are mad at me for not telling you this? It is a pretty crazy thing after all. Asked them, making them all look at each other before responding one by one. I understand why you didn't tell us, so it's fine. Nothing's changed after all, you're still my brother in all the ways that matter, Blake told him with a smile, his face looking as if Lucian was dumb for ever thinking this could change things between them. Alice spoke up next, a smirk on her face. All this means is that there's even more magic for me to learn out there, was her response, a look of giddy excitement at the prospect of more arcane knowledge. Alfred went next, a big grin on his face. You should know my stance. This doesn't change a thing besides there being more foes to challenge, he told his sire, confidence in his voice. The Nephilim then looked towards Alex, awaiting his spy's reply. I am your gatherer of secrets, but yours are your own to keep. I am merely glad you have enough trust in me to confide it to me, and I shall guard it like all the secrets I keep, was the spider demon's answer, loyalty shining through. To them it didn't matter where their sire came from, only that they served to the best of their ability. After the trio of demons it was Surtur's turn to answer. You are my lord, nothing will change that. Whatever you know of this world means little to me, only that you were the one to save me and grant me a name. That is enough for me, all else is meaningless, the large man said, his tone as if stating the obvious, and as if he was uncaring about the fact that he could be fictional in another world. For the half-giant it was pointless to fret over such things. He knew he existed and so he did, that was it in his mind, so any kind of existential breakdown was meaningless. All Surtur really took away from the reveal was that his lord knew much about this world and many others that others didn't. Shurzwa and Bulat went last, their faces nonchalant. We both already had our freakouts when we got summoned here. What you just said is honestly just par for the course at this point, was what Shurzwa said, the blonde somewhat wishing he had a smoke after all this nonsense. Yeah, the moment we came to this world we both came to accept that things were bigger than we ever thought. The fact that we're stories where you come from isn't nearly as shocking as finding out we're living in a world with people whose personal strength is greater than any Tegu, Bulat said after his friend, rubbing the back of his head at the end at the mention of such powerhouses. Lucian gave the man a nod of understanding at that. Finding out about the true dragons was a lot for anyone. The rest of the group consisted of the ones he'd recruited on his recent journey, and already knew everything, so they simply nodded towards him. Confirmation that everyone was handling everything well, he sighed out in relief. All right, then for the next order of business. Let's talk strategy. Lucian began to detail the plan he had for the Malstance army. It would be late in the night when everything was finished, and they had their plan of attack finalized. All the Nephilim thought in the end was how his coming harvest festival would go, failure not a thought in his head. It was the next day, and they now had their battle plan ironed out. But before they went off to the battlefield, Lucian knew he had a meeting to do after speaking with Alex. Before leaving for battle, he wished to speak with the leader of the Tengu village. So he now waited for the envoy to come down from the mountain to meet with him, Alex having given the message to them that he wished to meet. It was early morning, and a slight mist was coming down from the mountain peaks, which almost obscured the winged man's arrival. The white-winged man landed down in front of Lucian gently. The man seemed to scan him, taking his measure, it seemed. Only then did he speak. "The chief has invited you to the village in order to speak. If you would follow me, I shall show you the way," he said, voice lined with duty and formality. Lucian nodded in response before releasing his own wings. Once he did so, the Tengu took off into the air, clearly expecting the Nephilim to follow. He did so, flying through the fresh mountain air as he kept track of the envoy. It was a short enough flight, merely a few minutes, until they reached the peak of one of the tallest mountains. There at the peak of the mountain was a red torii gate that Lucian could tell had some strange spatial phenomena going on. With the Tengu landed before it and beckoned Lucian to walk through after his own landing. Silver-haired man paused for but a moment before entering through the gate. Once he walked under the red wooden fixture, he found himself in the pocket dimension that the Tengu called. The place was filled with old-school-style Japanese architecture and cherry blossoms in full bloom. To him it looked almost as if someone recreated a part of ancient Kyoto based on old scriptures and stories in a way. He stopped to admire it for a second before the motioning of his guide took his attention away. Lucian followed his guide through the sprawling village to the biggest building present. Was a short walk after that to reach the meeting room, the male Tengu entering a room within the large building through a paper door. A hushed exchange of words followed before the guide opened the door once more before motioning to enter. Once Lucian did so, he took in the room the meeting would be taking place in. Set on the tatami floor was a small table with a porcelain tea set placed upon it. Consisted of 3 walls made from thin paper like the door, the 4th wall being the one directly in front of him, and serving as an opening into a garden rather than as an actual wall. Some small furnishings dotted the room, seemingly more for decorative use than anything, but what drew the Nephilim's attention the most was the pretty woman with wolf ears, sitting Siza style before the table with a serene look on her face. "I take it you are the leader of this village, miss?" Lucian asked as he sat down cross-legged on the opposite side of the table so as to be face to face with the woman. She put her kimono-covered hand over her mouth as she answered the man's question. "Yes, I am the leader of this village, and I also serve as the Tengu elder. My name is Keed, may I inquire what yours may be?" she said, voice polite in a formal way. "My name is Lucian Silver. I am the leader of the group of people that you found lower down the mountain. May I ask what it is that you've called me here for, Elder Keed?" asked, voice respectful but not subservient. Keed seemed to shift slightly, her eyes becoming sharper and more wizened. She studied him for a moment with a look that held the weight of the years she lived and the skills that came with such. "Right to the point then, is it?" she said before going on. "Very well then, I'll be blunt. Your intentions for this mountain and my people." Lucian was glad she was willing to be blunt with him. He truly did not feel like playing games right now. Maybe if the battle was not so soon, he'd be willing to play the game of politics, but for now he preferred to get to the point. "Truthfully, me and my companions have no plans to interfere with your people, merely making use of the mountain range as a place away from prying eyes for the time being. Only be a short while longer before we leave the mountains, I believe," he told her honestly. She considered him for a moment before responding. "What do you intend to do with all the freed slaves then?" "We know that much, and we also know that should you try and relocate them, they would likely be found and sold back into slavery. For that country you are at odds with shall do nothing to stop such a thing, as I'm sure you are aware," she said then, a question laced in her words that was clear to him. He merely smiled at her at those words. "It's quite simple. Soon enough the nation of Malstans will cease to be, and the nation that takes its place will gladly welcome the freedmen. In fact, I'm certain that they'd be more than willing to make some form of alliance with you as well, he told her, a smile on his face, and not a hint of a lie upon his tongue. Oh, and how are you so certain about that? Keed asked, genuinely curious what made him think such a thing. Well, it's going to be pretty hard for them to remain a country once their military is killed in but a week's time by my hand, Lucian responded, a grin on his face that was at odds with his words as he unleashed his aura in order to show his power. And so, for the first time in years, the Tengu elder was rendered speechless. For before her was one she was certain was to become a player on the world stage. Only one thought went through her mind at feeling this man's power, and hearing his words. For she had lived long enough to gain a certain kind of instinct, and it told her one thing. It appears that a new demon lord is to be born soon. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter End notes. I have a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 54, Chapter 50. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Lucian looked out over the gathered forces below him, taking the measure of the might that Malstans had formed to fight against him. None of those on the ground had noticed his presence yet due to him hiding amongst the clouds. As he did so he thought back on how the meeting with Keed had gone. The conversation had wound down after his declaration that Malstans would be no more after this. In the end the two of them decided on a mutual no-interference agreement and an unspoken non-aggression pact. The Tengu would not bother Lucian and those under him, and in exchange the Tengu would need not fear action from them. It had seemed that the elder Tengu was wary of his power, and especially Surtur's. That made sense to him though. The large man's lava manipulation was perfect for destroying their sacred mountain. Should he in such an event, it was likely that the pocket realm the Tengu called home would collapse should their mountain become a volcano, and such a thing happening would spell disaster to say the least. After Lucian had returned from the meeting, though, he was briefed by Alex on all they'd learned in this time. This included important information about the troops now gathered below him. First up was the trained military force that the new king had managed to gather. These trained soldiers numbered around 17,000 all told, a sizable force. However, they weren't all that had taken to the field of battle that day. Alongside these trained men sworn to the kingdom were close to 5,500 mercenaries from a number of companies. Thankfully Alex had confirmed to him that Yum was not of their number. Something that his spy had also informed him about was how many soldiers didn't care for this conflict, and instead sided more with him. This group of soldiers was being led by Richard, it seemed, the young general from the Troll conflict. From what Alex was able to glean, they planned on staying back when the order to engage came, as well as keeping as many others back as they could as well. These weren't the only humans though that were among their number though. No, there were thousands of nearly completely untrained humans as well. These were the conscripted troops, the levies if you will. Unlike the trained troops who had armor and well-forged steel weapons, these men were in cloth armor for the most part, with second-hand weapons at best. Were a common enough type of soldier for medieval battles, so Lucian wasn't too surprised. The king had ordered as such. He only felt bad that they had to leave their families behind but who he felt the worst for was the next portion of the army that stood against him. These were the slaves, the grand majority of which were monsters and demi-humans. Scattered humans were among them, the unfortunate souls who found that their humanity wasn't enough to protect them from chains. Lucian made sure to look carefully at the slave troops as Alex had little information on them, the demon being why he knew the numbers of the previous troops. These were who he was most wary of though. Monsters could have unpredictable skills after all. It seemed though that there wasn't much for him to fear. There were a number of wild and mindless monsters like giant bats, black serpents, and even a basilisk. Chief among these mindless monsters was a greatly scaled beast. It lumbered on 2 legs with short bear-like arms, and a turtle-like carapace on its back. It seemed that the shell took the place of the wings a dragon-derived creature would normally have, for he could feel the thing's dragon factor from here. Around its head, something that looked more like it belonged to a dinosaur than anything else, was a furred mane that flowed like a lion. In all, it was a monster of great power that was at least A rank in power. According to his ultimate skill, it was this world's version of a Tarrasque, a draconic monster from French myth and D. Another standout among the more volatile monsters was what looked like a giant skeleton that was several stories tall. From what Puriel told him, this was a Gashadakuro, a type of undead that some necromancers could make with diligent practice. Alex had told him that the king had reached out to some magic casters from other nations. The only ones to respond really were those that practiced the less accepted arts, like the necromancer that was this thing's master and maker. Once the mindless ones had been catalogued by Lucian's discerning eyes, he moved on to the intelligent ones. There were a handful of different races present and in chains. Some lycanthropes of various types were there, alongside a band of harpies. Both had likely left for adventure from their respective nations, thinking their human disguise was enough to hide them, only to be proven wrong in the worst of ways. Of course, there were also some dwarves and elves, including dark elves. For most human nations saw them as no better than monsters in their jealousy of the two races' innate power. Ogres and lizard men were present as well, and oddly enough 2 hobgoblins. The hobgoblins were some of the slave troops that Alex was aware of, talk of them, and that Tarrasque were of particular discussion for the ones they'd spied on. Apparently Alex had found out that goblins were a popular race for enslavement due to how weak they were on. So the green ones were used for a litany of things, including as gladiators for underground blood sports. Sometimes though, very rarely, a goblin will survive enough battles as one that they evolve into a hobgoblin. At which point they are then usually sold to a war slave merchant for better money. Hence the 2 that now stood below him. It was as he was surveying the slaves that Lucian saw the encampment that the slavers themselves had set up and were currently in. They were there to command the enslaved troops, not to fight themselves, and so had set up a lavish tent to spend their time in. He was looking at this camp that he spotted more slaves, these ones serving a purpose distinctly different from battle from how scantily clad they were. The one didn't seem to be there for the debauchers to violate, but instead for some other purpose with how unadorned they were. For it was with a collar around her neck with its chains held by a man in disgustingly garish clothing, was a little girl with white hair dressed in rags. The sight of a child in such a situation infuriated him beyond measure, and made him have to look away before he decided to send a ball of Eclipse into the army to kill them all. Not the plan. No, the plan would ensure that innocents were spared, for he wished not for the blood of the innocent to stain his hands this day. If he had looked for a moment more, however, Lucian would have seen the little girl's hair shift to show her small horn. For now though, she was just a little girl he knew would be free at the end of this day. He would make certain of it. Lucian landed in the small camp that his inner circle had made a few miles away from the battleground. It was there that Alice and Kushina worked to set up a powerful barrier, a protective measure for when he would fall into slumber for the harvest festival. It was due to this forced sleep that he and those connected to him had given specific orders to the normal humans in their group. Shirzwa, Bullet, and Harley were all on protection duty for the rest in case the barrier that Alice was setting up failed or was breached. The Nephilim had requested his little witch to develop a barrier technique that could sustain itself for at least a short while, if not indefinitely, during their 3 months apart. Delivered as best she could, just as he knew she would. Thus Alice was now setting up a barrier that was tied to a piece of magisteel with carved runes in its surface, Kushina going over the theory of it with the young demon in order to see if any last-minute improvement could be made. The 9-tailed woman was proficient in her own barrier techniques, even if the Fuinjutsu from her world wasn't one-to-one here, so Alice had since been picking her. This had resulted in a few minor improvements to the formula Alice was using. We're just finishing up the final preparations for it to activate at a moment's notice. Decided to go and check on them first before making his way around the rest of the camp. How goes the barrier? He asked simply, getting the 2 women to look up from the 1-foot cube of magisteel. It's going great so far. Due to some inspiration from Kushina, I have gotten it to the point that it can last a little longer on its own by improving the efficiency, Alice told him with a big smile on her face. Lucian put his hand on his chin before asking his next question. And how long do you estimate it'll hold for now? He asked the duo. It was Kushina who responded this time to the inquiry. From our estimate it should last a good 2 days at least. Your little witch here is quite the prodigy, the foxy woman told him while giving Alice a small smile of affection. The Nephilim smiled at the sight and walked closer to Alice before putting a hand on the demon's head. Alice tried to pretend that she didn't like the show of affection but made no move to remove his hand from her head. Lucian just thought it was cute how she acted. The same demon that could level a small town by herself was embarrassed to receive affection. It was moments like this that he wanted to protect, and which gave him the resolve to do what he was about to do. To protect them, I need power. The world will come for us, so I shall make us ready, he thought to himself before bidding the two goodbye. He then made his way over to the makeshift sparring grounds a good few yards away from where the barrier was being set up. There he found Bullet and Shurzwa watching a sparring match between Alfred and Blake. From the looks of things, Blake had the upper hand though, utilizing his new abilities to get an edge on the white-haired man. Standing beside the two watchers, Lucian asked the two how long they'd been going for. About an hour I'd say at this point, Bullet told him, a chuckle in his voice at the words. Say what you will, but your brat's got a lot of endurance. I'm a bit surprised that Blake can keep up with him for so long, Shurzwa said from where he stood. Lucian just laughed at the two words. This made the two otherworlders look at him in a questioning manner. Deciding to elaborate, Lucian chose to explain a bit more about Blake too. In a battle of endurance, I'd actually hedge my bets on Blake. He has a skill that specifically boosts his endurance, that combined with incredible drive to improve, has made him capable of surpassing the stamina of even a normal enlightened. Then there's the fact that he's not using some of his more powerful moves, granted neither is Alfred. After all, my spawn can get stronger the longer a fight goes on, so he should be doing far more damage to his surroundings with each missed blow, he told the two, and as if summoned by his words, Blake dodged a punch from Alfred. When the white-haired demon's fist crashed into the earth, only a small chunk of dirt was displaced, a far cry from what would happen should he have been using Gladiator. Then knew that Lucian was right, for he'd seen what a blow from his friend did to the ground during a prolonged battle. The amount of times he'd been drenched in sand because of it made it hard to forget. Bullet meanwhile also came to understand what Lucian was saying. Made sense to the former soldier that the two were holding back quite a bit for this friendly bout, if more for the sake of their surroundings than anything else. Seeing that this fight was likely to go on for a while more, Lucian decided to move on and check in with the others. Making his way over to the fire pit that had been set up, and which had been used to cook last night's meal, he sat down among Harley and Ivy. The couple had been simply sitting here as the chaos around them went on, Harley to save her strength for guard duty, and Ivy to rest after the recon she'd done recently through the plants nearby, at his that had taken more out of her than the botanist had expected due to the massive range she had to cover in order to find them the optimal spot. Apparently her skill gave her more information than her old ways used to, leading to an information overload and a slight. Though from the looks of it to Lucian, spending time resting her head in her girlfriend's lap had helped alleviate it. So how are you two holding up? He asked the two, at which Ivy sat up from her lap pillow so the two could face him. Pretty good now after that bit of rest, was Ivy's response before getting glomped by Harley from behind. Yeah, she's all good now, pretty boy. Now it's just time to wait for you to do your thing, Harley said, using the teasing name she'd given him, one of many the bubbly blonde used. Lucian simply smiled slightly at the woman's words, having grown a bit used to the blonde's personality over the weeks spent traveling together. However, he adopted a more serious look on his face, as he decided now was the time to bring up something he'd been thinking about for some time. Ever since he'd transferred Ivy's soul into her new body, in fact. Glad to hear that. Now though, I have something I want to discuss with you, Ivy, he said to the green-skinned dryad. Sensing the change in tone, Ivy untangled Harley from around herself, and looked at the man who's helped them intently. She owed this man for saving her Harley, for giving them freedom to move beyond her tree. So whatever he was about to speak on, she felt it only right to give it due respect to hear out. She may have been a villain back in Gotham, but she was one who paid her debts, and was still capable of knowing gratitude. "All right, I'm listening, Gray," she told him in response. The name she called him leaving her for some reason Lucian had taken to one of the names Harley called her, Red. So in response to that, Ivy had started calling him Gray in return sometimes. It was more annoying for her though, since she wondered what made her Red, when there were two other redheads in the group, but she soon just accepted it. Ironically, it was better than being called Green. For some that aside, Lucian began to speak on what he'd aimed to do. "As you know from me explaining the Harvest Festival, as part of my evolution to Demon Lord, those connected to me will receive gifts. As such, due to you still being technically nameless, I was wondering if you'd be willing to receive a name from me in order to gain a gift as well," Lucian asked her, deciding to be blunt as he knew that was what she preferred. Ivy was a bit surprised at the offer. For some reason, despite hearing about naming and even talking with Kushina about how she was named, she had never really considered the idea of getting named herself. Looking towards Harley, she seemed to have been asking for advice, unsure what she should do for once. Harley, seeing the state of her partner, adopted a more serious look. Ever since having her thoughts made more clear, she had found it easier to take on a more serious disposition when needed, thankfully. "You do what you feel is best, Ivy. This is a chance to redefine yourself, and if you want to take it, I'll stand by you all the way," she told the green woman, hand on her lover's cheek as she stared into her eyes. Ivy took a deep breath before nodding in thanks to Harley, patting the hand on her face before disengaging. Looking at Lucian in the eyes, she steeled herself before giving her answer, the silver-haired man waiting patiently. "All right, I'll take that name you're offering if you don't mind," she told him, resolve firm in her voice as she spoke. Lucian smiled at her in an effort to be comforting after seeing all that. "Okay then, I thank you for being willing to accept a name from me. Any preferences on what you want it to be?" he asked her, seeing no point in not asking such a thing. She seemed to pause and think before answering. "Let me be Ivy, in truth this time. Let Pamela Isley die, and the poison be left in the past," she told him, wanting to take this chance to redefine herself in a world that knew not of her past. "Then, in that case, I name you Ivy. May you find your place in this world and be who you wish to be," Lucian said, feeling the pull of magicules from him flow into Ivy. The plant whisper glowed green, and he felt her power increase by a good margin. Seemed she evolved but instead reached the peak of what a Dryasdal Dryad could be in this moment, a process that would have taken her years normally to grow into seeing, as she's a relatively young Dryad. Once the glow died down, Ivy hugged Harley close to herself, glad that now she was Ivy in truth now, as she felt the name be engraved onto her very soul. Lucian decided to leave the 2B for now and go look for the last of his group. Nearby tree were who he was looking for, Historia and Alex. It seemed that the two were bonding over their shared natures, Historia, as a bee insectoid, and Alex being a spider. Like it also seemed Alex was thinking of how to use her ability to make lesser bees that she can control for information gathering. Lucian's spawn had a particular desire to have as much information as possible, it seemed. Walking up to them, Lucian simply watched them converse through thought communication for a while, happy to see them getting along. Eventually, though, he cleared his throat to get their attention. Turning around, the two took notice of him then, Historia buzzing in place for a moment in seeming excitement. "Good news, I might be able to help out Alex with gathering information." The Sunny Bee conveyed through thought communication, happy at the prospect of being useful to her. "That's great to hear, Historia. I'm sure you'll be a big help to Alex then," he told the childlike Queen Bee. She seemed to appreciate the encouragement from the happy little air dance she did, making both Lucian and Blake chuckle at the sight. Lucian then turned to Alex, getting a nod from the gray-haired demon. "She will be a great help for gathering large amounts of information," and keeping a lookout for threats over a large area. Speaking of threats, everything is prepared over at the camp with the freedmen. My double has briefed them all on what is to occur soon, Alex told him, almost seeming to fall into a reporting-like manner as they spoke. Lucian had come to expect that though from his spawn, Alex seemed to take more to a dutiful way of speaking and doing things than their siblings. It wasn't bad or anything, just the way they were and preferred to hold themselves. Thank you, Alex, it is about time that I begin this thing though. No more waiting, Lucian told the spymaster, getting a look of understanding from the demon. Lucian then called everyone together to announce the start of the plan. They gathered around the fire pit at his prompting, stopping what they were doing to listen to what their leader was. They knew that from the way he called them, serious and lacking in his normal warmth, that it was time for what they came for. So, once they were all gathered around him, the Nephilim that had recruited them all spoke up. I'll not waste any more time, we all know why we're here. I shall be flying over to the battlefield shortly, assume your predesignated places and duties. It's game time, he told them all, seeing no reason to go over the plan once more as he trusted in their competency. From the looks of determination he received in return, he felt that faith in the skill all the more proven to be well placed. With a final look at his assembled friends and family, Lucian took off, and with a heavy heart he steeled himself for what was to transpire. He looked out once more at the assembled forces, not truly taking in any true detail of the men below. No, instead his focus was on something else entirely. For Lucian was running the calculations on the weapon that would make him Demon Lord. He'd consulted Puriel to achieve this spell, a complex attack both from its ability to destroy and its ability to show. This spell required the use of manipulation and Puriel's soul abilities to scan through all the forces below. After all, through this scan he was able to mark out who was truly wanting and willing to fight and kill him, leaving out those who wished him and his no harm, or were forced into this battle by their leaders. The exempted also included the slaves who were being commanded to fight, though the mindless monsters were still to be targets in this attack. The ones holding the beasts' leashes were to die soon after all, and he didn't want them going on a rampage without their masters controlling them. There was to be enough death as it was already. All right then, he sighed out and pulled on Suzaku, fusing with the fire elemental. For the first he would need the additional power and control from what Puriel's calculations showed. Hell, it was only due to the increased calculation power that Puriel gave him access to that he was confident in using this attack. Without that there was no way he'd try this, the amount of variables overwhelming in number. As he fused with Suzaku, the Lucian activated dragon mode as well, needing the power the form granted him to pull this off. As he did this his body changed its shape, dragon scales covering his arms and hands, with his eyes gaining a draconic slit. Above his head a halo of blue fire formed, and most eye-catching of all 6 wings sprouted from his back. The bottom pair of wings were his silver draconic wings that ended with claws. At the top was his grey bat-like wings that marked him as a Nephilim, and the center pair highlighted it all as a pair of wings made from roaring blue fire due to his fusion with Suzaku. Upon assuming his new form, Lucian felt power flow into him like never before. Fire felt like an extension of his body now, like a limb instead of a tool like it had been before. The rush of energy was almost intoxicating in its intensity, but he held firm to his senses. First, he would announce himself and give them one final chance to settle this. He didn't think they'd take the offer, mind you, but this was war and there were rules. Even if his foes wouldn't show such consideration to him, it didn't mean he would stoop to their level. King Bulik sat on his makeshift throne in his elaborate tent, watching through the flaps as men moved about to complete various tasks. In a camp of so many soldiers there was always something needing done after all, though he himself didn't need to do much personally. Knew he was not a military mind really, leaving the commanding of the troops to generals that had been blooded in the battles his father had had them wage. If anything, it was at least these capable men that his father had left him, the only truly substantial thing left for him to inherit besides the throne itself. Bulik tightened his grip on his golden goblet full of mulled wine, angry at what little had been left for him after the punishment for his father's broken deal went through. The irony of thinking such things while holding a literal goblet of gold that cost more than most made in a lifetime was completely lost on him. Still, he seethed at the situation even these 3 months. Half the royal treasury, and their ancestral weapons, was a blow not easily shaken off. The young king felt as if a sword hung ready to take his head ever since, the nobles scheming like sharks that smelled blood in the water setting him on edge. The nation of Malstance was not a united one, it never had been, and Bulik imagined it never. That's what happens when one's throne was built by a warlord with the blood and tears of their enemies. The fact that many of the following kings had been less than loved didn't help, he mused. What had kept the nobles in line despite the generational grudges was the threat of the royal treasures. Those weapons combined with the gold to hire skilled mercenaries or slaves made a formidable threat to keep them in their lane. It was said that a man armed with one of the weapons of Bulik's forebears was worth almost 50 men armed with normal steel. That was more than enough when the crown could command a whole squad of them at a moment's notice. In addition to the crown's personnel, a few noble houses had gone extinct from such a force when they tried to usurp the crown from the Malstance royal family. Those now lost names served as strong reminders of what would happen in the event of rebellion. Now though, with a lessened purse and lacking many of the weapons that made his family feared, King Bulik was wary of what could happen. For now the nobles knew not how unstable his position really was, but they still took what they could, knowing he couldn't commit his attention to deal with what is comparatively greatly lesser concerns and insults. Such could be seen in how much the nobles took from him just to get their support in getting back what was rightfully his, as well as in how some sent only a token force with them to the battle, like Lord Noctis. Soon though he'd have that grey bastard before him, bloody and broken. Bulik would make him beg for mercy as he got the location of what had been taken from the mun. Then, when Lucian was just thinking he'd be let go, Bulik would see his head leave his shoulders. That should serve as a good enough example to the lords. It's been a while since a royal execution after all, to put fear into their hearts, he thought, a disgusting grin on his face. It was then though that he started to hear a commotion outside his tent. Eventually he grew curious enough to leave his cool tent out into the hot sun to see what was causing such a. After blinking the sunlight out of his eyes and adjusting to the change in illumination, Bulik saw most of his men looking upwards at the sky. The young king went to yell at them and demand they go back to work, thinking nothing in the sky could be so important as to make the whole camp stop and stare. That remark was stopped before it ever passed his lips though, as he followed the troops' gaze up into the sky. It was there he saw it, or rather him. 6 wings came from the back of the good-looking man. The silver hair of the man in combination with the wings made it apparent to all who this he seemed to be dressed in naught but black dress pants, matching shoes, and a white button-up dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his biceps. Even from here though it was possible to see the silver covering his arms, though they couldn't make out its scaled appearance from so far away. But it was the middle pair of burning blue wings that drew the eye the most, contrasted by his silver-grey wings that sandwiched them. Stealing his nerves in front of the one who he blamed all his misfortune on, King Bulik shouted out for all to hear as he addressed the monster that had swindled his oaf of a father. So the mighty so-called Nephilim finally decided to show himself. I'm happy to see you stopped hiding in your hole like the vermin you are. He shouted out to the mun, hoping to rally his troops with his mocking of the enemy. Lucian seemed to hear the small king's words, how Bulik wasn't exactly sure, having been certain that the moon was too far up in the sky to hear him clearly. After the Nephilim locked eyes with the royal though he spoke up. Shockingly somehow, despite the distance and sheer impossibility of it all, his voice was crystal clear to all that were there that day upon the battlefield. Hear me, King Bulik of Malstance. I offer you one chance to surrender, and one chance you will withdraw your troops and your orders for mine and my companions' heads, as well as agree to never bother us again. That is my terms. Should you reject them, then I promise you only decimation, the smooth and icy voice of the Nephilim said, sounding like an almighty judge delivering a sentence. Bulik felt sweat drip down his brow at the words, having heard them like the moon was directly in front of him despite seeing him flying hundreds of feet up in the sky. To add to the intimidation, Lucian unleashed his hockey unfiltered, letting all feel the weight of his words both metaphorically and literally through the pressure exerted on all present. It was only due. to the great distance between him and those on the ground that the wave of his presence didn't kill anyone. Still though, King Bulik believed in the superiority of his numerous men, and the monsters he'd gotten to participate through the slavers. As such, he had but one response. I refuse. The mighty kingdom of Malstance will never bow down in the face of a monster, the young ruler shouted out before turning to his closest general. Ready the men. I want him in chains before me by the time the sun sets on this land. Ordered, getting a salute and a yes, Your Majesty, from the men before he went to fulfill the however, all stopped abruptly once more when they heard the most unexpected of sounds. Chuckling that soon grew into a full-blown laugh. It was deep and carried with it a sharpness that spoke not of good cheer, but of a kind of morbid amusement. It didn't take a genius to know it was the men flying above them that served as the source of this laughter. After about half a minute the laughter died down, and the Nephilim spoke once more. So that is your answer, is it? Very well then, little king. However, I must inform you that sadly you will not live to see the next sunset, was the final word spoken by Lucian before he flew up higher into the sky. Bulik tried to laugh it off as a ridiculous boast once the moon was out of sight. Though none truly believed it, especially not himself. That feeling was soon proven right, but a few minutes later, as before all their eyes they saw something incredible. A second sun in the sky made of silver flames. What made it terrifying though was how it seemed to be getting bigger and bigger as time went on. It was then that many realized it wasn't actually getting bigger. It was getting closer. Shit, was the final word that left Bulik's mouth as his men panicked around him. Knew then, there was nothing he could do. Damn you, father, for involving us with this calamity, was the king's last thoughts before the silver flames consumed him, and he saw no more. Lucian had expected the king to refuse, though it still grated on his nerves. Not necessarily because he was mad at the king though. No, it was more so that now there was no going. With a deep sigh he began the chant for what would end this war before it ever truly. I call forth the flames to answer my will, to aid me in cleansing all that wronged me from this land. May my will form your fury, and my power your mercy. For I have judged them and found them wanting, those who desire my end. So now I bring forth their ruin and remove their stain upon this world. Come to me, great flames of damnation, judgment star, he chanted out, the first word summoning forth a silver-gray ball of flame that grew with each subsequent word. Once Lucian spoke the spell's name, the ball of fire was as large as a football stadium. The chant finished, the now small star began to fall, slowly at first though soon speeding up as it barreled towards the ground. Lucian heaved a breath of effort, the spell nearly draining him dry from the effort it took to cast. But as he looked down at the field being consumed by the flames he knew it was worth it. As the silvery flames swept across the land it covered people and structures alike. Though the flames seemed to ripple out in a wave. Once the flames had passed through an area no heat or fires remained, and buildings were left untouched. It soon became apparent that the flames were doing something though once it started to touch people, bodies falling over dead the moment the flames covered their forms. Not all fell dead however, though those that now were not but corpses were those that had been willing, and wanting to fight, and kill Lucian and his family. That was what the targeting had been for. As for what these flames did, well, they burned the victim's connection between soul and body, making them unable to cling to life any longer. Souls left the victims' bodies in droves, serving as an instant death for all they targeted. Even the monsters fell one by one, the Gashitakuro and Tarask holding out for a moment before their souls fled their bodies, as the Gashitakuro in particular fell apart into a pile of bone dust, the vengeful souls used to animate it no longer bound to the bones. It was as he watched this all that Lucian heard Puriel in his head, counting off the souls gained from this wave of death. Puriel counted off to him, telling him how many souls he'd claimed. As Lucian listened on as the number grew, a new alert came that he hadn't expected. Notice, due to specific actions the unique skill Retaliator has been acquired. His ultimate skill told him. What does this new skill do? He asked aloud, soon getting a response. After analyzing Retaliator, it has been determined that this skill allows for you to counterattack any harmful action regardless of distance, and in whatever manner you desire within reason, was the description he received. He ruminated on that for a moment, finding the skill to potentially be quite useful for tricky foes that dodge all you throw at them. It took only a little while longer though before his skill finished the count, and he readied himself for the final number. Final soul count equals 14,058 human souls. I have kept the gathered souls in soul storage to help delay the harvest festival, though this method will fail in less than 3. It is recommended to seek out shelter for the upcoming event, Puriel told him and advised. All right, but first there's something I need to do, Lucian spoke aloud before making his way to the ground. Specifically, he went to the tent where the slavers had set up camp and sought out the child he saw before. He hoped to spare her the sight of all the dead left in his wake. Spotting her curled up in a ball underneath a collapsed tent, likely having fallen from the panic his attack caused, he scooped her up. It hurt his heart that the little one didn't even so much as struggle at the act, seemingly having accepted whatever was to happen to her. Lucian swore then that she'd be well taken care of, that all the slaves would be once he freed them, so that no child ever was in such a position again. With a quick use of spatial motion, something he was only capable of due to Puriel holding off the harvest festival, he transported them to the camp his companions were in. The startled looks, for it had originally been the plan for Alex to get him with shadow movement at his call, Lucian set the small girl down before giving out orders. Precious, and he couldn't spare any on his usual politeness. Guard her while the festival takes place, he said while pointing at the trio of humans that would not be affected from the coming event. Then he turned to Alice and looked her right in the eyes. No order was needed, the witch demon moving to activate the barrier. The activation took less than half a minute, and it was just enough as he heard Puriel's voice once more just as the barrier was deployed fully. Soul storage can no longer hold back the gathered souls. Commencing the harvest festival was the last thing he heard before darkness claimed him once more. The words of the world then spoke up for all that were near Lucian to hear as the Nephilim's body glowed and shifted. Notice, the harvest festival has begun. The individual's physical constitution will be rebuilt, and he will evolve into a new race, the voice said for all to hear as Lucian's evolution to Demon Lord commenced. Confirmed, commencing super evolution from Arch-Nephilim race into harmonious evolution successful. All physical abilities have been greatly improved. The individual can now switch between material and spiritual bodies. Next, all skills and resistance already acquired by the old form will be reacquired. Successful. New intrinsic skills, infinite regeneration, Demon Lord's Hockey, universal perception, and universal thread have been acquired. New resistances, natural effects nullification, abnormal condition nullification. Spiritual attack resistance and spatial attack resistance have been acquired. This completes the evolution, the words of the world spoke, detailing the changes that had occurred within Lucian. Notice, petition from Puriel, Lord of Souls to attempt evolution of unique skills into ultimate skills has been given. Puriel spoke up, not wanting this to be the end of it for their partner. Request confirmed. Puriel may commence attempts at skill evolution, the words of the world responded. Notice, evolution of the unique skill soul bargain desired. Sacrificing retaliator to execute. Successful. The unique skill soul bargain has now evolved into the ultimate skill Mephistopheles, Lord of Contracts. Evolution of the unique skill essence of flame desired. Utilizing remnant energy from fusion with greater fire elemental Suzaku and magic flame transformation to help execute. Successful. The unique skill essence of flame has now evolved into the ultimate skill Hestia, Lord of Hearth and Flame. Evolution of the unique skill contradiction desired. Execution commenced immediately. And aided by words of the world. Successful. The unique skill contradiction has now evolved into the ultimate skill Harmonia, Lord of Balance. Puriel finished. Having now reached Lucian's current limit on ultimate, Blake looked on as Lucian's body kept shifting and changing, having fallen to the ground once the festival began. None of them dared move him though, too afraid to touch his glowing form at risk of harming him or themselves. After some time, though, his form settled down and solidified into a set form. He moved to go sit his brother up, or at least moved into a better position, when he was stopped by the words of the world once more speaking up. The harvest festival has been completed. Gifts will now be awarded to those close to them, the voice said, and soon after Blake felt himself grow incredibly tired. He was a bit surprised. He and Lucian hadn't been sure if Blake would be given a gift due to the oddness of his naming. It seemed that he would, and the young man couldn't help but wonder what was to come of this. When next I wake, will we be different? I hope not, and I believe that whatever is to pass, we will still be brothers. Isn't that right, Lucian? Were Blake's final thoughts as darkness claimed. Just as it had his brother moments before. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter and notes. I have a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early, as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 55, Chapter 51. Chapter notes. Incredibly sorry about the late upload. I completely blanked on it after updating every chapter just a little bit ago with edited versions. Very sorry about the delay. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Shortly before Lucian's attack, Richard looked around at his fellow soldiers, many the same men he led into battle. Not to they looked at him with respect, the respect one afforded to one's commander despite him no longer being so. After all was said and done, a commoner like himself was made the second in command of their group's commander for his efforts, something that was considered rare for one of his station to reach. But he knew, and perhaps the new commander did as well despite being not more than a stranger to them all, that the men in this unit still looked to Richard for leadership. He'd won their loyalty in the death and hardship facing the now. Here they stood, looking to him in askance of if they truly were to face off against the people who had saved them. To fight the ones who had won the day against those monsters at this very field, the ones who had treated their wounded and stood by them in blood and dirt. There were those here that would otherwise be dead or permanently crippled had it not been for Alice, and now their king commands the same woman's head alongside the one she chose to follow. To say they had been conflicted when those orders were given was an understatement. In the end, though they had all discussed the topic many times, Richard leading the meetings of the veterans of the Troll Crisis. The decision they reached was simple in all truth. They would not fight against the ones who aided them while the royals sat back in the capital. Eventually Richard got into contact with Lord Noctis, who was of a similar mind, and the plan was hatched. They all would stay back and try to rally as many men as possible to ignore the order to march when it was given. For they all saw the writing on the wall that this campaign was doomed from the start. Besides that, Richard would not repay his gratitude for Lucian and his companions with blood. It was as these thoughts passed through his mind that Richard heard the commotion. His men pointed up towards the sky, speaking words of shook at what they saw. Leader turned his head to spy what they were speaking of, only to soon come to understand their actions clearly. For there in the sky flying down from the heavens was Lucian. Richard heard the one-sided conversation between Nephilim and King, being too far away to hear King Bulik's words, so only knowing what Lucian spoke due to the strange magic he heard as Lucian gave the offer of surrender to the king, only to have it be denied by the royal from what Richard could tell considering the next words. The threat of not seeing the next sunset made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, for he knew that Lucian was not one for pointless boasts. The young commander looked around, seeing the men from other companies getting whipped up into battle-ready status. Only that didn't last long, as they all soon stopped dead at what was descending from the sky. A second son of gray-silver flames came crashing down in some form of apocalyptic myth brought to life. Richard saw as many men simply fell to their knees, whether in prayer or in despair depended on the man. He himself felt his own knees weaken, for at the end of the day he was but a man, and he was one facing what he saw as his. As the flames touched the ground, they seemed to expand outward from the point of impact. Waves of flames washing over all that stood before them. The commoner who had risen to glory and command looked on as the flames consumed many a man, but oddly they didn't turn to ash. It seemed as though the men it touched simply fell dead, like a puppet with its strings cut. before he could consider that though the flames were soon to be upon him, hadn't bothered to run like some of the other men, there was no point in his mind. There was no outrunning this. But as the flames went over him and Richard's view was filled with the burning fire, he felt no searing heat like he'd expected, no death claiming him from this world. Flames past their position. Richard saw that he and his men were left unharmed, all but the new commander. It was then that he understood, as he saw all the men he knew wished Lucian no ill, and the swaths of levies left untouched, that these flames were no danger to him. For these flames only sought the end of those that wished his former battle companion harm. It was at this realization that he did something that made many look at him oddly. He began to laugh in the way only those that had just avoided death can. He laughed at the impossibility of it all, at the power this man possessed, at the foolishness of his kings, both likely now having been killed by the power this man possessed. Collecting himself after a moment, one of his men helping him stand up straight after collapsing from his shocked laughter, Richard smiled a grim smile. It was odd that in the face of this death-filled battlefield that he could do such a thing. Yet, something in him told him things were to get better soon. For some reason I feel that a new day is upon this land, one that I can look forward to, he said aloud then, for if someone capable of such destruction was still capable of mercy, then perhaps there was still hope for a better tomorrow. Eri was confused and scared. She had been hiding curled up in the remains of the tent the mean men had taken her to, having tried to hide from the silver flames. Though she knew that such was pointless in truth, but she couldn't stop herself from trying. It was shortly after that she found herself picked up into strong arms and taken somewhere new. Eri hadn't resisted, knowing it would do her little good to try. When she finally opened her eyes, though, she found herself in a small camp, with a lot of unconscious people, oddly enough. She looked around in confusion, hands close to her face as she tried to make sense of what was happening. It was then that a pale-skinned woman walked up to her, the woman's pink and blue pigtails grabbing the little girl's attention for a moment. The bubbly woman knelt down before her and offered Eri a smile before speaking in a strange accent that she'd never heard before. "Hiya there, little unicorn, how you doing?" she said to the little girl. Eri had no way of knowing it, but she was only able to understand this woman due to Harley making use of the magic sense trick for communication that Lucian taught her. This was in fact the first time Eri had found someone who she could understand that didn't bark orders at her, the ones who kept her in this world, finding no reason to waste a translation spell on her except to give her orders to heal someone. So shyly and hesitantly she answered the blonde. Eri said it more like a question than an answer, not having been asked this question before as far as she could remember. Harley was able to tell that this was all overwhelming for the little one, even without her degree it was obvious. So she sat down next to the girl and motioned to Bulat to grab some food by pointing at the still warm pot of stew that hung over the simmering fire. "Well, that's good. Hey sweetie, if you don't mind me asking, what's your name?" the former villainess asked, keeping her voice calm and comforting. "I'm Eri," the white-haired little girl told her, for some reason feeling more at ease around this strange woman. Perhaps it was the fact that almost all of her tormentors had been men up to this point that Eri was more quick to ease up around Harley. Whatever the reason was, when Harley patted the spot next to her, Eri sat down and didn't feel like she was in danger. At least not as much as she usually did. Bulat came over with 2 bowls of still warm stew, the sight of the big man making Eri tense up even with the man's warm smile. Harley took the 2 bowls and discreetly told the large man to stay back for now, getting a grim nod in return. "Well, my name's Harley," the psychologist said as she handed the little one a bowl. "It's nice to meet you, Eri." Eri took the bowl carefully, still wary despite the comforting smile Harley gave her. After seeing the woman next to her do the same, Eri took the spoon that came with the bowl and put a spoonful of stew in her mouth. It was so good to her, a flavor explosion to her taste buds despite the fact it was not more than a basic stew. For her though, it was probably the best thing she ever tasted. That was why Eri was confused that tears seemed to be streaking down her face as she ate. Harley watched on, anger building up inside her that she hid for now from the little one's anger, at what this little girl had gone through to be like this, at what gave her all those scars on her body. Harley was skilled enough in the medical field beyond just the human mind to tell those were needles and medical scars. But she was also knowledgeable enough to know those weren't normal ones, but instead those seen from experimentation. It was similar to what she'd seen on some of the other rouges after some of the Cruella Arkham visits. Eventually, though, the girl seemed to cry herself to sleep, a half-finished bowl of stew left in. Harley sighed out, once more seeing the cruelness of humanity, and wondering how people like the Bat could still exist. How someone could still see all this cruelty, and still try, and find the best in people. Now that her mind was clear, she could see how much Batman tried to help her, to help many of his villains. Harley could see now how he tried to help her leave the Joker, the talks with Arkham guards to have her moved away from the clown now stark in her mind. However, it was as she picked up the small girl, and tucked her into the blankets of her tent that Harley came to understand. It was people like this that made the heroes still come about. The scarred and downtrodden that needed protection, that was what made them still seek to better the world. Maybe, just maybe I can try to as well in this new world, Harley thought, her resolve firming up as she saw Ari whimper in her sleep. Taking the girl's head into her lap, Harley tried to soothe her through the nightmares, stroking her head, as she hummed a tune she half remembered. Bullet and Sherswa looked on at the scene before nodding to each other. They'd take over guard duty for Harley, the little one needed her now it seemed. When Ivy woke up next, it was to find that roughly 12 hours had passed. She'd stood up from where she laid down, a bit surprised to not find Harley nearby. Sherswa had told her how long she'd been asleep, after she spotted him guarding the perimeter closest to her. Then asked about Harley only for the blonde man to point towards the sleeping area. Over to where the man had pointed, she soon spotted her Harley seemingly having fallen asleep comforting a small child. Ivy had many questions, mainly about why Lucian had taken this small one here. Was answered quickly though when she spotted the marks on the little girl's arms after she shifted in her sleep. After that, it was plain to her that this girl had been in a less than ideal situation, and Lucian took issue with that. Ivy smiled despite herself though at the calm look on Harley's sleeping face before walking over to the now dead campfire. She knew that the others were likely to awaken soon. As she sat down, Ivy took stock of herself and the changes that the gift had brought on. The green-skinned woman felt stronger than before, and she felt an even deeper connection to the plant life around her. It felt almost like she could sense the peace that all the plants seemed to be in right now, and something told her that if anything were to change that she'd know right away. That wasn't all that changed though. Now Ivy was no longer a Dryas doll dryad, in fact she wasn't even a dryad at all anymore but something more. For Ivy was now a nymph, at least that's what the voice that Lucian had told was called the words of the world had said she was now. From what little information she had imprinted on her from her evolution, a nymph was a rare existence. Nymphs shared much in common with their fairy relatives, almost a fusion of fairy and dryad in a way. This had made her no longer reliant on her old tree body at all. In fact, Ivy was positive that she could use another vessel made of something other than her Dryas doll one if she wanted. She's also gained the new intrinsic skill elemental sense, this skill allowing her to sense the presence of elementals around her, including the young and unformed ones. She wasn't sure what all this could be used for yet though. As the others woke up, they joined her around the fire pit, seeming to decide to wait for Lucian to wake before taking down the barrier, or do anything else. As they sat around waiting, they started to go over all that they'd received from their gifts. Surtur's change was the most obvious, now standing over 15 feet tall in his base form, and capable of growing larger now should he wish. His skin had also changed, being darker in color like tilled earth, and when he grew bigger than his base form it gained a red hue. According to the men, he was now what was known as a fire giant, a being of fire and earth. He had used his now improved compression skill to shrink down to a still tall 6.5 feet in order to sit with them around the restarted fire, and went on to tell them all about the other boon he'd gained. Surtur now had a unique skill called eruption, a skill that let him not only control lava through the skill lava domination but transform his body into the element both fully and partially. The big lug seemed quite happy with the skill from the big grin on. Meanwhile, Alice and Alfred had both evolved into demon lords, though they both said they felt they just barely became so. As it was, the two demons said that they were of the lowest tier of their new race, though neither seemed mad about that. Alice in particular seemed happy with her new increased magic capacity, while Alfred was badgering Shurzwa for a spar to test out his new strength. It was Alex, however, that had gained the most. It seemed to Alex was now an archdemon, and had gained a unique skill of their own. It was called Dark Infiltrator, which granted them the sub-skills Shapeshift, Sticky Steel Thread, Shadow Movement, and the new skill Convince. Convince seemed to allow the spy to now make their lies more convincing to those without any resistance to mental attacks, as well as make their disguises be accepted more easily by others. It was a pretty perfect skill for the spy master, certainly something that they wished they'd had when infiltrating the slave markets. Kushina had also evolved, though her skills seemed to remain the same for now. Ivy's fellow redhead was now a kitsune in truth, her true form now being her humanoid form with fox ears and 9 tails. This new race of hers also came with a new intrinsic skill in the form of spiritual attack resistance, likely as a way to resist others' illusions. Besides that, however, not much changed for the former Kunoichi. Historia had meanwhile entered some form of cocoon despite being a bee. The bubbly little honeybee, it seemed, would not be joining them for a little while from what Ivy could tell. That left Blake, who joined them all last. He looked the same to Ivy's eyes, but something had changed in him. The young man seemed stronger in a way that Ivy only noticed due to instinct rather than from what she saw with her eyes. Apparently he'd received a new unique skill, as well, from the Harvest Festival gift. This skill was called Heroic Inspiration, and it allowed him to increase the power of his allies and subordinates during combat. It also seemed to make him more charismatic, though it was a minor thing really. There also was another part to this skill that Blake said he felt was beyond him for now, unsure what it was with so little time with the skill. Ivy was glad she'd agreed to receive a name from Lucian after seeing all this. The new power she felt within herself was more than worth it, and seeing all the gifts the others gained made her feel hopeful that there was more to her gift than she knew. It wouldn't surprise her to find that there was more to being a nymph than just being stronger and more independent from what Blake said. There was no record of such a race before. Now, we just have to wait for color-washed Goldilocks to wake up, she thought to herself with a grin. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 56, Chapter 52. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Lucian woke gently, like he had just had the most restful sleep of either of his lives. Opened his eyes. The sun was what he noticed first, looking to be setting in the west now. Had no idea how long he had been asleep, though he knew all seemed to be well since the barrier was still up around the camp. Sitting up drew the attention of his companions though, Blake doing his best to get the others not to swarm him. The Nephilim looked to them then and smiled a gentle smile. "So, what I miss?" he asked, a teasing lift to his voice as he got his brother to shake his head in bemusement. After standing up, Lucian was hugged close by his red-headed brother. They just stood like that for a moment before Blake broke the hug with a pat on the back. "You've been asleep for 3 days and that's the first thing you ask, you jerk," the young man said, joy in his voice despite the words. The two just laughed then, happy that all was well. They walked up to the circle of their comrades that sat around a roaring fire. From the pot hanging above the flames and the smell, it seemed some form of stew was cooking, one of the things that everyone in camp knew how to make with at least some success. That meant it was likely one of their less culinary inclined members' turn to cook tonight, Lucian mused, having been the one to make sure they all could cook at least the basics so they wouldn't starve should they be separated. As he and Blake walked over and sat down, the redhead began to fill him in on what had happened while he slept. This included what he knew about everyone's evolutions and gifts, and what the remains of the army of Malstance had done since the attack. Apparently the army was still there, with most of their leaders now dead. They didn't have as good a logistic corps to get everyone moving in just 3 days. Mostly the remaining men had been treating the wounded that arose from panic and collecting the dead, alongside getting things slowly but surely packed up so they could march home. It made sense to Lucian that such was the case. Armies of that size do not move easily, and even with the likely hundreds of deserters it was still a large number of men. However, it was what Blake said about the slaves that grabbed his attention. Apparently with their masters now dead, whatever binding magic had been placed on them was now gone. So they went on to break each other's chains and freed themselves before slowly organizing themselves. What Alex had overheard using their skills in reconnaissance, it seemed that there was talks going on in their number, on what to do, and a number wished to find Lucian himself. Why though? To give thanks maybe? Lucian asked, hoping to understand what these newly freed men were thinking. Yes, but from what Alex says, not just that. Many of them recognized your power after what you did, and even without knowledge of the Harvest Festival are calling you a demon lord, if just one who has yet to assume the mantle. In their eyes, you are someone deserving of the respect such a title represents. Some are speaking of finding you in order to swear allegiance, Blake told him, answering his question, and giving Lucian a whole lot more. The Nephilim had thought they wouldn't wish to do something like that after just being saved from bondage. But it seemed the mentality of monsters and even humans in this world was different than he was used to. In truth, the freed one saw it as such. Lucian was someone deserving of their willing allegiance. Their old masters had done no such thing, and were cruel. Lucian's act of mercy in sparing so many instead of some indiscriminate attack was having a more profound impact, it seemed, than he ever envisioned. The whole situation made him have to think things over more deeply, as well as consider changing his plans. Initially he had thought to go straight to Demon Lord Carrion and challenge him for his position in such a way that would be witnessed by all the Demon Lords. That way he could then put his backing as a Demon Lord behind Blake to help ensure his ascension as the new king here. Now though, it might be best to take a more split approach to first though, he needed to know what cards he had to play now. So he asked Blake and the others to give him some time to think as he spoke with Puriel on all that had changed. Blake gave him a smile and a nod before giving him some space. Lucian thanked the young man and then focused inward. Puriel, please give me a breakdown of what has changed in me after the Harvest Festival, he requested of the skill. After the events of the Harvest Festival, the following has changed. You have evolved into the race Harmonious Nephilim. You have gained the ultimate skills Hestia, Lord of Hearth and Flame, Mephistopheles, Lord of Contracts, and Harmonia, Lord of Balance. You are now in possession of natural effects nullification, abnormal condition nullification, spiritual attack resistance, and spatial attack resistance as new resistances. What would you like to know more about first? Puriel told him and also asked the follow-up question they knew he'd have. The show of increased intelligence made Lucian smile before responding. I already know what the new resistances mean, so first I'd like to see what information you have on my new race, and then all you have on my ultimate skills, he told Puriel, excited to see what all he'd gained. Very well. Your new race of Harmonious Nephilim is the equivalent to the demon race's Devil Lord and the angel race's Seraph. This new race, as its name implies, now not only has a balance of angelic and demonic factors, but has them harmonizing together to enhance each other. It is believed that in time the creation of Nephilim factor may be possible with this. This race also is inherently of a divine nature, granting you divinity, was the race summary that the angelic skill gave him. Lucian was pleasantly surprised at the information. The idea that he could gain Nephilim factor eventually made him excited, as till now his race came from the balance of factor. From a demon and an angel. The possibility of creating actual Nephilim factor made his head swim with ideas. But he had his new ultimate skills to understand first. Your first new ultimate skill, Mephistopheles, Lord of Contracts, is the evolution of the unique skill Soul Bargain. As such, it possesses all the abilities of the skill, though now at a higher level. In addition, Mephistopheles allows you to create deals in the form of physical contracts. These contracts can be used to facilitate deals between yourself and others, or two separate parties with you acting as the middleman of sorts. You are now also capable of canceling a deal at any time, with all gains reverting to their original owner, as well as choosing the punishment for others breaking deals with you. Do Mephistopheles incorporating the abilities of the sacrificed skill Retaliator. It should be noted that the possibilities for what you may make a deal with have now been. Next, Hestia, Lord of Hearth and Flame, is the evolution of the unique skill essence of as such it possesses all the abilities of the skill at a higher level, as well as the previous extra skill Magic Flame Transformation, now Esoteric Flame Transformation, which will allow you to transform into any unnatural flame you can create. In addition, Hestia now has the new subskills Ember Creation and Ember Bestowment. These subskills allow you to create an ember from your own power over time, taking around a month to make each one, and then grant these embers to another through a soul corridor to grant them the unique gift Ember of the Hearth. Ember of the Hearth grants its bearer increased abilities in fire magic and fire resistance, as well as granting increased potential by unlocking one's hidden potential by igniting it, as well as granting increased growth rate. You have 7 embers to start with. Puriel told him the description of his first 2 ultimate skills, making Lucian's jaw drop. You're telling me that now I can grant all my companions a power boost, and a boost to their, he asked the skill in shock, trying not to blurt it out loud. Should you have enough embers for them all? Yes, that is what I am telling you, was the somewhat deadpan reply the skill gave him at his question. Lucian had to take a second to absorb that. Eventually, though, he asked his other questions about the skill. How did it gain such a thing? And why does it take a month to make an ember? Asked and soon got a reply. The subskills Ember Creation and Ember Bestowment came about by incorporating information about the unique skill Diligence. By studying the effects of this skill through the connection between you and Blake, enough information was gathered to create this ability based on the skill's effects. As for your second question, should you try to speed up the creation of an ember? The risk of it being destabilized comes into should an ember become unstable it will explode, and as embers are made within your ultimate skill, something very close to your soul, such an event would result in damage to your soul that could be fatal. As such, for your own safety, requests to speed up the creation of an ember will not be honored, were the answers Puriel gave him, making Lucian go pale at the possible consequences outlined. The idea of having something explode so close to his soul did not sound good. It honestly frightened him a bit, and Puriel seemed to sense this. You have nothing to fear, as long as the process is not forcefully sped up there is no risk of failure, or an ember becoming unstable, the angelic skill assured him, making him breath out a sigh in relief. Collecting himself after that scare, he then asked for what his final ultimate skill could do. Finally, Harmonia, Lord of Balance, is the evolution of the unique skill Contradiction. As such, it has all the abilities of the previous skill, at a higher level. This includes the subskills Yin Manipulation and Yang Manipulation, becoming Yin Domination and Yang Domination, respectively. This ultimate skill also is now able to separate combined phenomena, as well as resist complex attacks through the new subskill Composite Resistance. This includes things such as mystic arts and combined elements. Puriel finished telling him all he'd gained. Lucian smiled then, happy at what all he'd gotten. The new resistance skill would let him resist some of the more powerful attacks in this world, mystic arts being some scary things from what he remembered. The possibilities that these skills gave him was almost overwhelming, and they certainly made him start to rebuild his plans. There was a lot to do now, and he felt that these new tools would help him out immensely with doing it all. Looked around at the people he had gathered around him, though, he only felt more assured. Though he did notice one of them missing. Oh yeah, Historia entered some kind of cocoon. Lucian remembered then what Blake told him had happened to the little bee. So he got up from where he stood and walked over to find the cocoon he'd been told about. Didn't take long to find it. Lucian, now standing before it and wondering what was going on, the one known as Historia, is evolving into a greater being. Would you like to lend your energy to speed this process up and increase the power of the resulting evolution? Asked him at that moment, seeming to take his curiosity as permission to analyze the cocoon. He hardly needed to think about his answer to that question. So he lifted his right arm out towards the cocoon, and felt his magicules leave his body in a rush. The cocoon began to glow in a myriad of colors, shifting and swaying at the influx of energy. It took a solid few minutes to finish pulling on his magicules, long enough for the others to gather around to see what was happening. Then, the cocoon burst open, revealing Historia's new form. The once normal-looking, if larger than normal by a wide margin, Bee was now something else entirely. They were still small, about the size of an 8-year-old girl from Lucian's estimates. She was now humanoid in appearance, looking like a little girl with blonde hair going down her back. Yellow armor-like plates were on her forearms and shins though, as well as a strange armored yellow and black dress covering her body that looked like a sundress in design. She now also possessed eyes that were human in appearance, though the white of her eyes was instead black, which highlighted her yellow irises all the more. Fluffy antennae came from her forehead right below her hairline to finish out her new appearance. Lucian was surprised at the little bee's new look, having expected something a bit more armored-like. Like what a pedo and Zygon looked like from his memories. Instead she looked almost like a bee-inspired magical girl almost. He wasn't mad at it, don't get him wrong. Just was a bit of an unexpected development. Thanks for the help, Master. The somewhat high-pitched and cutesy voice that came from Historia was also an unexpected surprise to him for some reason. After the words left Historia's newly gained mouth, silence followed for a bit. That was until an equally youthful voice, if far shyer, said something so quietly that if not for the dead silence it would have gone unheard. The little girl that he rescued from the battlefield said from her position next to Lucian had been told by Blake that the girl was being taken care of by Harley for now, so it wasn't shocking to hear the little one speak. What was a surprise that made him need his brain to reboot was her appearance. It was the first time he got a good look at the little gray-haired girl. In particular, it was the first good look he'd gotten of her face. And the red eyes and single horn made him certain then of who this young girl was. He shouted in his head, eyes wide at seeing Ari of all people here. Lucian felt then that things were going to get hectic soon, even more than he'd expected. He sat back as he listened to the others speak on the recent development. The news of what had happened to the nation of Malstance had reached them quickly, though with their network that was only to be expected. What Granbell hadn't expected was that the foolish king of Malstance, both the previous one and the last that had just died, had caused it to. In his many years he'd come to know many things, and how to recognize them as. It was thus plain to him what had occurred: a demon lord had been born. Part of him wished to have the ability to bring those fools back to life just so he could kill them himself for this mess. The birth of a new demon lord was practically inviting chaos to come, chaos he had no hand in causing or controlling. This had the potential to disrupt his plans. The fall of such a large nation and the rise of a new threat only posed trouble for his. The fact that this happened to a member of the council made this all the more. It made the Council of the West look weak. Made him look weak that he couldn't protect a member nation from such a threat. The whole situation was a mess and a half. It was times like these that made him miss his wife all the more, if for no other reason than to have someone to share such frustrations with. But she was gone, and he had to take charge. So he pointedly cleared his throat in order to gain the others' attention. He'd decided what their course of action should be. Bickering and panicking serves us little. Instead, we shall plan. Malstance was always too big a nation in terms of land, and worse was underutilizing it. Now with the arrogant line of rulers dead, a civil war is nearly inevitable. So we shall wait until clear factions are made in the ruin of the nation of Malstance, and support those who we can control. In the end, Malstance shall be broken up into smaller and more easily controllable nations for us to do as we like with them. Is this understood? He told the rest of the council his plan and thoughts. None truly dared to question him, what counted for his descendants lacking the spine to truly challenge him on anything of importance. As such they all nodded along to his decree before holding their glasses out. Granbell knew what that meant and held up his own glass before saying the words. All exists to serve the Rossos, he declared before taking a sip of the red wine that filled his. All exists to serve the Rossos, the others responded in kind before drinking from their own glasses. Despite the situation, Granbell smiled into his glass. He was optimistic at this turn of events. While the rise of a new demon lord was a problem, the seizure of Malston's former territory would be a boon long term. Perhaps he could even set up one of his more loyal descendants to be a ruler of one of the new nations made up from the old kingdoms. It would be a good way to help foster more loyal service from them all if nothing. Edited, January 29, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. Patreon/random note, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 57, Chapter 53. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes A/N. Just wanted to announce that a new character stat sheet is being released alongside this chapter, so if any of you want to check it out, it's there for you to do so. It'll be in a separate post from this story under this account. Lucian was silent for a little while after seeing the new form of Historia, and seeing Eri now before him. For some reason, seeing the little time-bending unicorn was shocking to him, even with his experience with meeting the likes of Bulat and Shirzwa that he knew from other. The fact that he found her as a slave here only made him even more angry, knowing the hell this little girl had been through even before coming to this world. First she gets experimented on and tortured by Overhaul, only to be summoned here and made a slave. This poor girl has the worst luck, the Nephilim thought to himself. Historia seemed to like the compliment from Eri though, and flew over in front of her. You really mean it? You think I'm cute? The bubbly bee asked, seeming to give the white-haired girl doe eyes somehow. Eri seemed to want to hide behind Harley's legs at first before the blonde gave her a comforting pat on the back. With a look between them, the little girl seemed to ask Harley if it was all right, whether that be that was for permission, or if Historia was safe. Lucian didn't. Regardless, the little one stepped forward and gave a cute little nod. Historia had waited patiently for a response from the traumatized girl, seeming to sense something about her that made the newly evolved bee want to be gentle with her. When Eri nodded though, Historia did a flip in the air in excitement. You know, you're pretty cute too, you know. The insector told her, a big grin on her face in joy. Eri seemed confused at the comment and pointed at herself. You think? She asked hesitantly, not being used to being complimented at all. Historia nodded like a kid on a sugar rush at that question. You're a little cutie. What's your name, cutie? Historia asked her, seeming happy at the idea of making a new friend. As the two introduced themselves to each other, Lucian and the others looked at the scene with smiles on their faces. It was times like this that made Lucian remember that Historia was actually fairly young. How young he wasn't sure, since he never bothered to ask. Yellow Bundle of Joy had in many ways the mentality of a child, with some rare moments of the Nephilim. Honestly didn't know if that was solely due to her age, or if it was just her personality, and to be truthful he didn't care. His little bumblebee was how she was, and he saw no reason to investigate it overly much. What he was curious about was what else Historia had gained from the Harvest Festival gift. Puriel luckily was able to inform him, using the soul corridor between them to gather the information. The one known as Historia has gained the unique skill Hive Queen. Hive Queen grants her the ability to create lesser bees that she can then share senses with, as well as serve as extensions of herself in order to use skills through. Puriel explained to him the relatively simple skill. I can see how that can be pretty useful in the future, especially with her ability to improve crop growth, Lucian thought to himself at the information. After letting the two get to know each other a little bit, Lucian decided to go over to the pair. He knelt down to be more at Eri's height, which was also the height Historia was floating around at. Then he put a hand on the excitable bee's head and patted her head. It's wonderful to see you so lively, Historia, he said as he gave the little one head pats, getting a nod of approval from the bee. Of course, master. I can speak now and I look so cute, how could I not be, she said as she raised her arms in a celebratory way. Lucian chuckled at that and gave her a final pat on the head before turning to Eri. And what might your name be? he asked, deciding to be polite and honestly not wanting to explain the whole omniverse thing to such a young and traumatized girl. I'm Ari, she replied while looking towards the ground, seemingly too afraid to look him, and Lucian then looked to Harley, and she stepped forward as he told the little girl his name in, "That's a pretty name." "Mine's Lucian and it's nice to meet you," he told her while trying to sound as friendly and approachable as he could. Harley then spoke up, getting Ari to finally stop studying the ground for the secrets of the, "He's the one I was telling you about, the nice man who helped out me and Ivy as well as bringing you here before needing to nap. You remember that?" she said to the girl, her experience with the girl however brief seeming to be positive enough to get her to relax after hearing those words, though Ari looked Lucian in the eye for the first time before bowing, something she remembered seeing some of the men at the compound do to say, "Thank you very much, mister. It's much nicer here with Miss Harley," she said, sincerity coming from the whole of her tiny being. Lucian chuckled at that and told her to stand up. "Well, I'm glad to hear that. I hope the others have been nice to you too," he said, and got a rapid nod of the head in return. It was as she looked at him with those innocent eyes and deep wariness that Lucian understood something. Anyone who hurt this little unicorn would burn. Of that he was certain. After things calmed down somewhat and Lucian got everything back at camp sorted out, he reached a decision on what his next move was. That lead to now, with the silver-haired man walking up to the camp of now freed slaves comprised of so many different races. Presence didn't go unnoticed for long, not that he was hiding it at all in the first place. Crowd formed that seemed like they wanted to swarm him, and yet also parted for him as he moved through the camp. Whether that was due to fear, respect, or both he couldn't tell. In time though he seemed to make it to around the center of the camp, and 3 people came. These 3 seemed to be the leaders of their respective groups, human, demi-human, and monster. The human was a slim woman, almost malnourished in a way from her waifish look. She had dirty blonde hair and Lucian felt he recognized her from the slavers' tents, being one of the slaves brought here for something other than war. Her eyes were ice blue, cold in a way that didn't fit her younger appearance. If Lucian had to guess, she was maybe in her mid-20s at the oldest, though it wouldn't surprise him to find she was next was the leader of the demi-humans, a thick-muscled dwarf with a ginger-red beard. Looked stern, hard in the ways only hard labor and long years of resentment could make. Face seemed carved from stone, though gratitude seemed to shine in his eyes more easily than the human woman next to him. This man was likely a slave meant for making weapons that could also serve as a battle slave if the need arose, the scars on his thick arms coming from more than just the forge. Last was the leader of the monsters, a lycanthrope from the looks of him. From a short glance Lucian guessed he was a bear lycanthrope with his brown rounded ears and sharp. The fact that he looked like he could put any human bodybuilder to shame despite his less than stellar living conditions for however long also helped in that assessment. Looked like the embodiment of the phrase "a bear of a man" in every conceivable way. Though despite Lucian clocking him as the strongest of the 3, the men seemed to be the most approachable. "Hello, my name is Lucian Silver. I take it you are the ones that have been chosen to represent your respective groups?" he asked the trio, already knowing the answer but needing something to open the conversation with. We are the ones that have been trying to keep this group of freedmen together," the dwarf said, voice gruff like a smoker from the low ventilation forge he was forced to work in. "For so long." The bearman spoke next once the dwarf confirmed Lucian's assumption. "That and making sure those remaining soldiers you left breathing didn't try anything funny," he said in a deep baritone voice and crossed his arms across his chest. Lucian considered them for a moment at those words, understanding the tension they must have been feeling at the presence of the armed men nearby. "All right then, I'll be blunt then. My actions freed you, and so it's my responsibility to help you all get from here on. So, all that wish to return to your homes, I will do my best to help you get back to it. But I do want to know what you all want," he told them honestly. The Nephilim truly felt this way, finding it cruel to leave these newly freed people to fend for themselves. In his mind it was his responsibility to care for them until they were in a place where they could fend for themselves. The fact that he was being honest in those words seemed to make the 3 somewhat surprised. After turning to each other they seemed to decide what they wished to do and spoke up one by one. As the one in charge of the Magian here, I can say that we all wish to serve you from here on. As you know, we monsters respect the strong, and not only are you strong, but we all owe you a debt. We all were actually thinking about going out to find you for that very reason. So, if you'll accept us, we'd be more than happy to swear ourselves to you. Doubts your strength, he said as he walked up to Lucian and knelt down before him. Seemingly at that, as if some sort of signal, the rest of the monsters that were physically able knelt down as well. Lucian was a bit stunned but came to understand the situation soon. In these monsters' eyes he had proven himself strong and deserving of respect. The fact that his actions freed them all making that even more so. For them, who had been in chains for so long, and having none of their former leaders come for them, it was only logical to seek out someone strong enough to protect them. The fact that they were currently in human territory didn't help their situation any either. What is your name, warrior? Lucian finally spoke, asking the name of the lycanthrope. He looked up at him at those words and answered quickly and respectfully. I am not in the possession of one, my lord, he said before bowing his head once more. Lucian considered that, a bit surprised to find that lycanthropes could be named like other. Nothing from the source material said anything to the contrary though, and even if it didn't matter since this is how it worked here. So after giving it some thought, Lucian knew what he would respond with. I will gladly accept your allegiance, so rise Otso and be welcomed into my service, he told the man, naming him in the process of accepting his allegiance. The now named Otso rose up then, a glow around him that soon died down as he looked at Lucian with gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Lord Lucian, he said before stepping back to allow one of the other members of the trio to speak. The silver-haired man gave a nod to his new subordinate as the dwarf stepped up next. Seemed to stare down Lucian for a moment before speaking to him. There are many among the demi-humans that wish to return to their homes. Others wish to try their luck with you, having no home to go back to. So if you're honestly wanting to help us, then I'll follow you until every last one of us that wants to have made their way home, he said to Lucian, a look of hesitant trust in his eyes. For him it was the best course of action, and if Lucian wished to do them wrong he had no reason to lie in order to do so. The show of power made that abundantly clear. That paired with their lack of resources made him their best bet on getting home. Lucian then held out his hand to the man after hearing his words. Then I look forward to working with you. I have a temporary encampment with other freed slaves you can set up at until I can speak with your home nations and coordinate getting you all home, he told him with a smile on his face and promise in his eyes. The dwarf grabbed his hand then and gave it a firm shake, seemingly coming to the decision to trust him after seeing him for himself. The name's Torek, and that sounds just fine, lad, he responded in his gruff voice before letting go of Lucian's hand and stepping back. Finally it was the human woman that spoke up, having been quiet this whole time until now. Lord Lucian, she began in a soft voice that held little inflection. She seemed to steel herself after those few words before continuing. Bluntly put, none of the humans here wished to stay here. It was the slavers' standard procedure to kill all the family of any human slave they took in order to not have anyone alert the authorities. Human slavery is technically illegal in the human nations after all, so they took greater care to hide their tracks. So, none of us have a home to return to, and the human world has been less than kind to us all, she told him with as composed a face as she could manage. Lucian took all this in, feeling sadness and pity settle in his gut at their situation. At least the demi-humans had the possibility of a home, and loved ones to return to, the humans though had nothing it seemed. So what is it you wish to do then? He asked her gently, hoping there was something he could do for them. She took in a deep breath then before responding to the question. It is of the opinion of all here that the human realms have done us no favors. So we'd like to try and see if the realm of monsters might be any better. With that said, we'd be more than glad to follow you. Your mentioning of a shelter for freed slaves only makes it all the more clear that following you is the right path, she told him while looking him directly in the eyes. Well then. Lucian went to respond, admiring the courage in this beaten-down woman. Bethany, she told him, understanding his pause as asking for her name. Bethany, I will gladly accept you all and bring you to my settlement. Whatever you all wish to do from there, I will support you all in as best I can, he told her, getting a slight smile from the woman before she stepped back once more. Once that was all taken care of, Lucian sent a message to the others. After that, in a flash of light, his companions were transported to the field. A flurry of activity sprung forth then, healing supplies being distributed, and Alice going around helping who she could. The others started handing out supplies from Alex's massive shopping spree, others yet like Bullet rounding up all those in fighting condition to see how they'd been organizing their numbers to keep watch on the human soldiers. It was chaos in many ways, an organized chaos though in due time. Lucian looked on, processing the fact he now had so many people to care for. It was a bit overwhelming, and he was a tad scared, to be honest. Scared of letting these people who put their faith in him down. This although made his next steps all the clearer, for he knew he needed territory of his own and fast. It seems I'll be needing to arrange a meeting with the Beastmaster sooner than later, he thought to himself before looking in the direction of the remaining forces of Malstance. He also needed to speak with that group as well before he could set off, and he quite frankly wasn't looking forward to it. Lucian wondered what they would see when they looked at him. A butcher? A monster? He didn't know, and while the thought that none of those words would be incorrect to describe him, it didn't make it any easier to accept. The Nephilim didn't regret his decision, though he did regret the situation becoming what it was in some way, but that didn't mean he liked what he had to do. For now his hands were stained in blood, and that would never go away. Blake seemed to sense the turmoil he was feeling, and placed a hand on his shoulder. You only did what you felt you had to, they would have never stopped hunting us and you besides, due to your actions all these people are free, the redhead told his brother, trying to reassure him. Lucian looked back at him, and gave a small smile. Oh, how the tables have turned, you're comforting me for once, he teased, getting a chuckle out of the young man at the comment. It was as they shared that small moment that Lucian felt more at peace with his decision. Had acted to protect this right here, and he would not regret doing that. Edited, February 7, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. Patreon/random note, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 58, Chapter 50 for chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. It took roughly 4 hours to get the camp of freedmen organized into a more functional state. Medical treatment was being administered, new clothing given out to replace rags, and lacking attire, and food given to out. Many times Alex's body doubles needed to remind them to slow down in their eating so as to not make themselves sick, the spy demon having used their skill to make more bodies to speed up the distribution of supplies. In the end though, everyone had been stabilized and none were at further risk of deterioration from their previous treatment. At least, physically speaking at least. Harley had told Lucian that they all would likely need extensive counseling for some time. He sighed at the memory of that brief conversation, the blonde psychologist looking lost yet determined at the task before her. She didn't even entertain the thought of not helping out, whether that was due to some professional pride, a sense of responsibility as the only qualified person here to help deal with such issues, or a desire to atone for what she'd done under the Joker's influence. Lucian wasn't sure. Everyone in camp knew how some of the memories she had from working for the Joker kept her up at night, her nightmares not being hidden in a camp full of those with enhanced hearing in the least. Moving on from that though, Lucian had gathered up all the materials from the less intelligent monsters he'd killed in his attack, after making sure everything was in order. Tarask in particular intrigued him, and Blake had asked to have a few samples of its scales for further studies into crafting with it. The Nephilim was more than happy to oblige that request after having seen some of the gear the redhead had made in their time apart. Lucian's somewhat untrained eyes, it seemed that his little brother was progressing quite well as a craftsman, and may reach the level of Kaijin, and the dwarf brothers in due time, maybe a few years at most. However, after all this he knew it was time to go to the other side of the battlefield. Human survivors needed to be addressed. However, Lucian figured he didn't need to just stroll into their camp, that was a good way for someone to wind up dead. Not him, mind you, but Lucian knew his new durability was insane. A normal human punch to his face was more likely to break the fist that punched him than hurt Lucian himself. The thought did make him chuckle though a bit at now having the same problem as Spider-Man. So in order to try and avoid any such confrontation, he used material creation to make 2 slips of paper and a pen. After finding a flat enough surface, he wrote a message onto each before seeking out Alex. His stealthy spawn would be perfect for delivering these to their intended recipient. It was oh so nice that 2 of the humans in Malstance he actually had a good relationship with were there in the human camp. Hopefully by leaning on that connection this would go far more smoothly. Richard walked out of his tent, formerly their unit's commander's tent. With the men dead though, the men of his unit had decided he was the most deserving of it. In their words, he was who they truly followed anyway. It both touched him deeply and made him feel the weight of responsibility at the same time to have been told that. Now though he was leaving the encampment of his men by the light of the moon. For he'd found a note on fine parchment in his bed not but hours before, signed by a name he knew well. Lucian Silver. It had been signed in practiced handwriting. At first Richard had wanted to call it an ill-done jest of sorts, but the fact that none of his men had seen anyone enter the tent before him made him quickly abandon that notion. The letter, for that's what it was, had told him that the man he owed his life to wished to speak, and gave a place and time to do so. Commoner turned commander was more than willing to follow the instructions in the note. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the man who saved him, and his men's lives not too long as he made his way to a small clearing a ways away from the 2 separate camps that had been set up, one for the men who marched under the banner of a now fallen kingdom, and one for those who marched here in chains now broken. Richard noticed another man making his way to the destination. At first he placed his hand on the pommel of his sword, ready to cut down any would-be stalker that may wish him ill. Then he got a better look at the man in the light of the almost full moon, and eased up. It was Lord Noctis, a man who he'd spoken with before on the ill fate that the now-dead king had been leading them to and their shared acquaintance. It seemed the noble noticed him as well, and had a similar reaction to Richard's presence. After a moment of looking at one another they shared a nod, and walked together to the meeting place. It wasn't hard for the brown-haired man to put together that the noble had likely gotten a similar letter, and had heeded its words. In but a few more minutes the 2 had made it to the clearing and took a few more steps towards the center. It was once they crossed some unseen boundary that the view of a grassy clearing changed, the feeling of passing through a thin film-like substance alerting the 2 to what had happened. The clearing now possessed a lit campfire with a roasting beast of some kind over it and a long wooden table at which 2 people sat. With 2 more chairs waiting for occupants, and the recognizable faces sitting in the occupied ones, it was clear to them what had happened, and what was going on. A well-made barrier. Lord Lucian, you have my compliments, Lord Noctis said, his choice of address confusing Richard. From the look on Lucian's face he was also confused, and asked about the odd form of address as he spoke up. I thank you for the compliment, though I find myself confused as to why you call me Lord, he said plainly, curiosity in his voice slightly. Richard looked at his fellow citizen of Malstance, wishing to hear the answer as well. Noble straightened his attire, a military surcoat over a hardened leather tunic, and gave his, well, it is only right to do so. After all, how else am I to address a demon lord? He asked with a teasing grin that seemed to hide a degree of nervousness. For a moment all was silent in the clearing bar but the crackling of the fire. It seemed Lucian had not expected that from the man, but soon collected himself. Then, the silver-haired man laughed, and all the tension broke like glass on stone. Ha ha ha, I didn't realize you were in the know of how one awakens as a demon lord. Though, with your brother seeming to know more than the normal human, perhaps I should have anticipated you would be aware of my ascension, the now confirmed new demon lord said, seeming to find some form of humor in the situation. Richard meanwhile only looked at all present in shock. Demon lords were not something to mess with, and now the man who'd saved his life proclaimed himself one. Granted, he only did so after being called out as such by Lord Noctis, but still. One did not just call themselves A demon lord without at least some form of power to back it up. Historically, that was a quick if convoluted way to get yourself killed. The dark-haired lord however went on without any care for Richard's shocked expression he knew was on his face. Once I saw the casualty report, I had my suspicions that was what happened. The fact that only now you have come seeking to speak with us made me certain, after I remembered the tales of the sleep the harvest festival is said to induce, he said in that practiced and elegant voice of his, all the while Richard couldn't be more lost onto what was being spoken of. Sighing, the young soldier sat down at the wooden table, glad that the seats seemed to be cushioned somehow so as to rest his weary bones. He had no idea what the number of casualties had to do with anything, nor what this harvest festival was. All the poor man knew was something had happened, and now the Nephilim was a demon lord. That and that he needed a drink already, and felt that desire was only to grow more intense as the conversation progressed. So you're a demon lord now. Great, what does that mean for us all now? In fact, not to be rude, but why did you call us here? Richard asked, tired more than he could ever remember, and losing some of his normally more respectful demeanor as a result. Lucian chuckled at Richard's question and tone of voice. It was things like that that made it all the more obvious that the man was in his 20s, the tired look being something Lucian recognized from the mirror in his college days. The Nephilim kinda wished he had some coffee or something to offer the man, but sadly he had no such thing. So instead he decided to answer the man's question. In short, I want your help to ensure that the people of Malstance do not suffer what is to come from my actions, he said, and at the questioning look from both Richard and Noctis he went on to explain what he meant by that. With a sigh and a pat on the back from Blake he continued on. It is inevitable that without any clear heir to the throne, and your decimated military, that some form of civil war is going to break out. That and the likely interference of nearby nations who hope to get something out of the ensuing chaos will mean terrible things for the common man. The increase in crime will be but one factor, the forced conscription another. So I have a plan that I seek your aid in to help prevent this from happening as best I can, he told them, metaphorically laying his cards out on the table. At his words Richard delved into deep thought. He knew the man's words held truth in them. The likely death and violence his countrymen would face in the coming days would be from the look on Noctis's face. He had reached the same conclusion. It was not some idle prediction but practically a certainty if all was left as is. Neither of the two men wanted that for the people, they cared for their fellow men after all, unlike most in power. So Richard decided to speak up for them both then. And what would this plan entail? He asked, genuinely wanting to know what miracle solution the men had in mind. At that Lucian turned to Blake, the redhead taking it as some form of cue before speaking to support me as king, and I shall rally this nation together in order to face the coming storm, the young man said, conviction burning through his words. Richard sat back at that declaration, floored for a moment. In the end though, he did the only thing he could in that moment. He laughed. You crazy bastard. You know what? You'll certainly be better than any of the other pricks that'll be chomping at the bit for whatever scrap of power they can get. Richard shouted out, getting a smile from Blake in response. Noctis didn't seem to have any true objections either. Richard would later find out that the men sensed the power in the redhead, and that was what helped make the man's decision. The noble sensed that this young man had the strength to uphold his words, and that combined with what he knew of the redhead's character made the decision clear to him. So with all that, the noble only had one thing to say. Where do we start? Shizu looked back at her student, Hinata, having come to the gate to see her off. Hearing about the war and its results that Lucian had been a part of, the Japanese woman had made her decision. She would go to him, seek him out, and see if he was still the same man. Shizu felt in her heart though that she would not be disappointed, but still she had questions. Giving her student one last nod of encouragement, and a smile that promised they'd see one another again, she headed off. She'd only found out what all had happened so quickly due to her student's resources. Holy Empire had sent spies and informants to Malstance in order to gain information. Some luckily, since they were under orders to not engage in any fighting, they had been spared in Lucian's attack. This allowed them to quickly send the information back to Hinata, had then shared the information with her, leading to the current situation of her leaving once more to go see her wayward travel companion. Shizu had decided to travel by foot even with the far longer travel time than using the warp gate the church had access to. Using the piece of spatial magic would have drawn attention to her that she didn't wish to face right now. She was still considered a hero after all, and she wished not for any rumors to spread about her going to slay a new demon lord. Knew that he was one now, having learned about how one is born from her teacher long ago. Strangely, the knowledge that her dear friend now had so much blood on his hands didn't disgust her though. In a way, though, it made sense to her. Shizu had plenty of blood on her hands as well, and most of it wasn't due to some accident or anything. Be it human or Magian, she had ended many lives over the decades, and besides, his killing was in a war. In her mind, such killing was acceptable to a certain extent, regrettable yes, but not something that made Lucian evil in her eyes. No civilians were killed, and only those that seemed to have wanted to harm him were killed from the reports. Many of the wars human kings waged had far worse casualties, and often caused the deaths of many innocents. In a way, by doing what he did, Shizu figured he likely actually saved lives, all things considered. That all made it so she wished not to draw attention to herself and potentially send the wrong message to him through the rumors she knew would spring up should any know where she was heading. So she walked along the road for some time before breaking out into a sprint. Rejected the horse Hinata had offered her, knowing her own speed was greater than any normal steed. Her stamina was also greater than the horses in the stables after the training she had done with Lucian and Blake. Honestly, she had pushed herself even more in this time apart in order to not let either completely outstrip her in strength, though she knew Lucian likely was now far beyond her after awakening as a demon lord. She knew not how much the redhead had grown though, and looked forward to testing the young man once more. "I'm coming to see you boys. I just hope you don't get into even more trouble before I get there," she said to herself with a smile on her face and the wind in her hair. Alex tailed up the numbers and information they'd gained about all in the camp. How many people there were here, and of what race they were, was collected and written down for their use. It had become their job to organize everything together to get them ready to move out in the coming days to head to the settlement they'd spent the last few months setting up. It was only left to the spider demon due to their experience in such matters, but quite honestly they felt overwhelmed in the extreme. Thankfully, it seemed that their lord had understood this, and after confiding their struggles to him, Lucian had promised that soon another would come to help in this regard. Alex was an information gatherer, not a commander or a bureaucrat, so doing such tasks were not their forte. Though Alfred and Alice would have honestly been worse for the job, Alfred not having any mind for logistics and Alice more concerned with magic than people skills. Bullet was probably the best for this, but sadly he was human, and thus didn't command the respect needed by the monsters in order to give orders and the like. Lucian had taken in all this information, and told Alex it would be taken care of. The mumbling about a white one however confused them greatly. Honestly though, Alex is just glad to know this paperwork, and such will soon be someone else's problem. "I'm much better at observing people than talking to them after all," they said to themselves before sighing out loud and looking over the information once more. Until whoever their lord intended to take over this task came, they were in charge of this. Alex was looking forward to their arrival more and more every minute. They had a project to get back to that was far more interesting to them after all. One of their body doubles had spotted one of the beasts they were looking for, and hopefully soon Surtur wouldn't be the only one with a familiar. The thought made them smile with anticipation. Edited, February 7, 2026. Chapter End Notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. Patreon/random note, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 59, Interlude 4, Origin of a Unicorn and Checking in on a Blacksmith. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Ari huddled deeper into the bed sheets, shaking from head to toe. It had been another collection day for her as she'd taken to thinking of them. Overhaul had apparently felt he was close to a breakthrough and needed more material to test it. That session of being unmade and put back together ended just an hour ago, and now she was shaking from the phantom no matter how many times she went through it, having her body drained of blood only to have her very being be torn to threads and put back together again so as to drain her again never got any better. Unknown to her, that was in part due to her nerves never being able to get used to the pain. Never being able to deaden from the shock and making each case feel just as painful as the all that pain was engraved into her mind, though despite the relative health of her body. She may be whole now, but Eri knew what it was like to torn apart over and over again, a torture that was almost biblical in intensity. And yet it wasn't some villain who'd blasphemed against the gods, but a little girl that was experiencing it all. She hated it, hated being in this room, and its darkness only to be taken for slaughter whenever the bird-masked men wanted. I wish I was anywhere else. She mumbles into the pillow she held against her body in order to calm her shakes. It seemed that the little girl's sincere wish was heard though, as Eri was consumed in a pillar. Eri then found herself falling with a rainbow of light around her, and a strange voice speaking to her. Presence of abnormal factor detected. Translating so-called quirk factor into new constitution. Successful. The new race variant human material has been assigned. Unique skill reversion has been created as an intrinsic skill for the individual known as Eri, the strange voice said, Eri not truly understanding what this all meant. Soon though she passed out from the experience, her dreams of escaping filling her mind. This then influenced the voice, granting more skills to the little girl. Though she had no idea what they would be for now. Desire to be free of pain acknowledged, the skill pain resistance has been acquired. Desire for control has been acknowledged, the extra skill self-regulate had been acquired and incorporated into intrinsic skill reversion, the voice went on before stopping, Eri's soul not possessing any further capacity for new skills from her young age. When next Eri woke up, it was to the sight of some robed men standing around in a circle. She didn't understand the words of the men, only that they seemed to be disappointed at her appearance. It was when they caught a glimpse of her horn though that things became worse. Not only have we failed and summoned a child, but it's a demi-human child. Report this to the king, the lead mage shouted out, angry at this utter failure in his eyes. He was a newly appointed head mage of a small kingdom in the west that was under the Gastone, was the name of their nation, and they had intended to summon a hero of some sort to help with their financial crisis. Having a skilled warrior would have been useful, from hunting monsters for money to having them become some sort of fighter for public events like the tournaments in Ingracia. Though some had been hoping for one with a production unique skill in order to get a revitalization of their industry. Now though they had a useless girl that was inhuman. The mage was thinking at incredible speeds, trying to think of a way to avoid the punishment the king was sure to give him for this failure. The amount of resources burnt on this was not something insignificant after all. It also wouldn't just be his head that roller for this, at best the others would be discredited forevermore. So the rest looked to him, waiting to see what solution he could come up with. Eventually a solution hit him. Since she's a demi-human of some kind, we can sell her to the slavers. She should fetch a nice price, but even if she doesn't, we just need her to disappear. We can tell the king that the ritual was a fake or something, blame it on those that found the damn thing in order to save our hides. He told them the plan, getting nods after that before they all burst into action. In next to no time Eri found herself in chains, and taken out of the strange stone building, and she was too weak to fight this, too weak to run for now. She was then brought down to the darker and seedier parts of the city they were in. After entering a ramshackle building made of aging wood, a bag of coins was given to the man that held her chains after some talking between them, and a scary man in a dark cloak. Eri's chains were then given to the cloaked man, and she was put to sleep with a spinning magic circle. That was how Eri found herself in a new cage, in a new world, but still chained down. The chains were far more literal though. She was tested and prodded to see what she could do, her new captors wanting to know all they could about this new demi-human race that they thought she was. She only knew this was what they were doing, as the lead slaver had ordered a translation spell cast on her so Eri could follow orders. Eventually though, her Curse acted upon her and struck one of her captors in self-defense. As they continued their panicking, Eri tried, with all her might, to stop the energy from her horn, just like she tried every time. However, this time, it actually worked. Initially she was terrified this incident would make them treat her worse, but it was not the case, thankfully. The men she'd hit with her curse had actually been injured not too long ago, and had just recently healed. Important as the wound had left a scar on his face, a scar that was no longer there after the blast of energy from Eri. The slavers realized what this meant and quickly made efforts to profit from her healing abilities. So that was how Eri was made into an underground healing service, and when the slavers she was now chained to went off to war, they made sure to bring their healer, with one never knows what could happen in war after all. Kaijin hammered away at his latest piece, though his mind was elsewhere. He'd heard the news from Malstance, heard of how the young man he'd fashioned a weapon for had killed thousands in but mere moments. However, he also heard of the mercy shown to those who wished not to fight. Heard of the slaves freed and innocents left alive. These thoughts made him put down his hammer, the mistake in the steel far too blatant for one of his skill to make. Should he have been in his right mind? So instead Kaijin sat back down on his favorite chair, after putting everything away in order to sort through his thoughts. Unlike what many may think, he did not condemn his friend for the deaths now on his hands. No, Kaijin was far too old for that and had seen what war could do. The death it could bring. To those both fighting and not. With this in mind, he honestly felt that the swift end to the war may have saved more lives than it took. So, if he was not truly bothered by the blood that now was on his friend's hands, what was he concerned with? How the world would respond was what plagued his thoughts. Kaijin was under no delusion that King Gazel didn't know about him and Lucian's friendship. He knew better than most not to underestimate the intelligence-gathering capabilities of the nation of Dworgen. That, combined with the greater vigil the king had now after the slaver incident, made it all but guaranteed that he knew of the smith's connection with the Nephilim. So the worry about if his king would seek him out to inquire about the silver-haired man was on his mind. But what truly worried him was what the other nations would do at this news. It would not surprise him to find that many of the human nations thought of Lucian as a demon lord now. The fact was that any monster capable of decimating such an army and potentially bringing a nation like Malstance to heel could not be considered anything less, if for nothing more than pride. That meant that Lucian was now likely to be seen as an enemy of humanity, and that made him concerned for his friend. Those that enter the world stage can rarely leave it in one piece, Kaijin said aloud with a sigh, wondering what Lucian would do now. For if his friend didn't handle this carefully, he may be facing something even he couldn't. Edited, February 7, 2026. Chapter and notes. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early, as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Chapter 60, Chapter 55. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Noctis sat back and contemplated the plan he'd been told. To be honest, it was well thought out in his opinion, and was certainly something he could see working. From how it had been told to him, the plan was such: both he and Richard would publicly support Blake as a contender for the throne in order to have the support of the military. Richard was a well-respected commander and rallied the common people immensely, while Noctis himself held the respect of the majority of the upper brass of the military, and had some connections to a few minor noble houses. That would already grant them a lot of support for this endeavor. But the plan went beyond that by quite a bit at that. Somehow Lucian had a skilled spy master on his side, and had given to both him and Richard a folder that held detailed information on many high-ranking individuals in the nation. More specifically, information that was prime blackmail material that they could either use to strong-arm them into supporting their cause, or by use to discredit them and remove them from the board. All things that had been buried in the shadows of the aristocracy that would make the people riot were common in the documents Noctis had been handed. I honestly made him sick at knowing that his fellow countrymen did some of these things. All the more reason for someone new and untainted to take the helm, he thought to himself after remembering some of the horrors detailed in that packet. Bloodsport and slaves were but part of it. Drug trafficking, and the employment of foreign mages to do evil deeds were what made it even worse. For instance, one lord had employed a magian to cast an artificial disease to affect his populace after finding out about a planned. Noctis remembered that incident, though he had thought it merely an unfortunate act of thousands had died in not just that noble territory, but in many surrounding ones as well when the disease proved uncontrollable. Many of them elderly and children. It all made him realize how much rot was in his nation, and how this could be the opportunity to cut it. Furthermore, there was another aspect to this plan that would make Blake all the easier to put on the throne, the endorsement of Lucian himself. From how he'd come to understand the plan, Lucian was willing to play the bad guy and threatened to continue the war until all the nobility were whipped out. However, the narrative they would then spin is that Blake convinced him to keep showing the nation of Malstance mercy. Lucian agreed on only one condition, Blake becoming the new leader of the nation, as he'd lost all faith and trust in any of the nobility to not stab him in the back and continue committing the crime of slavery. That combined with the information campaign revealing the former king's hiring of slaves, and the deal that was struck with the slaver organization would get the common people more than on board. Noctis honestly, though, by the time they were done the people would be begging for Blake to take the throne. When it was revealed that he was a hero candidate, that would only become all the more assured. This is a remarkably well thought out plan, I must say. How long have you been cooking this up, Lord Lucian? Noctis asked, truly impressed with this plan the Nephilim had made. Lucian himself chuckled at that before answering him. Since shortly after the war was declared, actually. I knew that if left to its own devices, Malstance would forever be a thorn in my side. I couldn't have that, especially if they called on the Council of West in order to name me an enemy of humanity. That may have even forced the Western Holy Church to act, and that all would cause a big mess. So I figured it was best to leave someone I trust in charge instead. Besides, I believe in my brother to be a good king, he said, his final words brimming with sincerity. It was Richard that spoke up after that, his words somewhat surprising to Noctis. And that's a good enough reason for me. I fought alongside you both, and know you to be good men, far better than most that are in charge of this nation. The former king imprisoned my friends, you freed them. If that doesn't show the difference between your rules, then I don't know what will, the young commander said, his words simple yet holding great truth. Noctis couldn't help but agree with those words and voiced as such. Thus it was decided in that late-night meeting not too far from the battlefield that a new king would be crowned. Noble was looking forward to this one's reign far more than the last, that was for sure. The next morning Blake went off to go see Lord Noctis and Richard to go speak with the soldiers that remained. Lucian saw his brother off before walking some distance away once more, a new goal in mind that he knew he needed to do before he could head off to Eurasania and challenge Carrion. This would solve his current major problem hopefully. That problem was the lack of anyone skilled in logistics to take charge of the freedmen that now were either in his care, or now had sworn themselves to him. Alex was the best for the job available till now, but the spider demon wasn't truly inclined for such things. Lucian's other spawn also were not suited for such things. They could perhaps teach magical or martial skills respectively, and maybe Alice could lead a research group. But leading a large group like this was not in their list of skills. The others weren't too good at this either. Shirzwa and Bulat being human made it difficult for them to command the others due to the freedmen all having bad experiences with humans. Even the humans among their number were not too trusting of them, strong men being the ones who kept them in chains. Harley and Ivy weren't able to take charge either, although for different reasons. The former accomplice to the clown prince of crime was more suited for small groups and interpersonal relationships rather than taking charge of whole swaths of, while Ivy was at best an introvert, and at worst still quite misanthropic in nature, thus making her an ill choice to lead them. Kushina was not a good fit either, her temper sometimes still got the best of her, and she was more trained in how to kill than to lead. Historia was obviously out since she was more childlike in mentality than anything else. And Surtur was good at taking orders, not giving so, with him needing to get to Eurysania soon in order to cement a position on the Demon Lord Council. Lucian needed someone who would be loyal and capable of leading this band of freedmen. That led him to only one possible recruit on such short notice, one who he could gain the loyalty of through strength. Thus he set out into the woods and began to recall all he remembered about demon summoning. Eventually he made it far enough from the main camp, not wanting to risk the others should this go wrong. Then, with a deep breath, formed the circle to initiate the summoning. I call forth a demon from the darkness of hell, and offer forth a vessel in exchange for your. I call upon the name of Blanc, and ask that you come forth and judge if I am worthy. Lucian shouted out, pouring large amounts of energy into the circle to act as a beacon for the one he called out to. The summoning circle spun rapidly, and a white light burst from it that bathed the woods in burning white. When the light died down, a figure now stood before him, a woman clad in a white regal dress. She had hair that was white as snow, and eyes red like blood. Around her seemed to burn and freeze all at once, and her gaze cut into him like a sword of. Lucian could only think of her as a beautiful queen of ice with the grace of a swan. Almost lost himself in looking at this being of ancient grace before remembering why he'd called such a being forth when she spoke. So you are the one who called upon me. And what exactly is it you are looking for from one such as I? The being of ice and grace spoke, her voice demanding an answer in the way a queen would give an order. Lucian didn't show an ounce of weakness, knowing he couldn't afford it now in front of this I am and I have. I have summoned you in order to make you my subordinate, for I have use of one such as you, he told her, being blunt in what he wanted, for he knew there was no point in being coy. She looked at him more consideringly than before, unleashing her demon lord hockey. Despite the oppressive aura that came from her, Lucian stood tall, and didn't so much as flinch. That made the one known as Blanc a bit surprised to see that this man may not be just another fool begging for death at the hands of her white flames. So she decided to at least humor this human, not being aware that he was anything but. Very well, prove to me then that you are worthy, and I'll do so gladly, she responded to him with condescension plain to hear in her voice. Lucian smiled at that, willing to play the white one's game. So for the first time since his evolution he unleashed his full power, having been suppressing it nearly completely since the harvest festival in order not to harm those near him. Once he let the seal on his power go, though a weight fell onto the land for close to a mile in diameter. The power was so great and suffocating that the trees bent and the grass flattened, the aura so dense that Blanc found herself unconsciously almost falling to her knees. What made her completely fall into a kneeling position before him was when she realized something about his aura. For as she sensed this pressure, the likes of which she hadn't felt in millennia, Blanc detected something strange about it. Both holy and demonic energies flared inside this aura, not fighting each other or remaining at odds, but instead in perfect balance with each other. Should be impossible, for even the chaos element normally made from the fusion of such energies was just that, chaotic. This though felt calm, like the two lived in harmony within this man before her. All this made her ask but one question in her shock. What are you? She yelled from her knelt form, all her decorum thrown out at this contradiction before her. Lucian kept a smirk on his face as he answered her, showing the bearing of a lord and power. I am a Nephilim, the fusion of demon and angel that has surpassed both. With that said, I shall ask you now, Blanc the primordial demon of white, will you follow me? He asked her after answering the question, as he restrained his power once more. Now being able to stand once more, Blanc looked at the silver-haired man that had summoned her. Face was blank, as if carved from ice, as she thought. In the end, though, she knelt before him of her own will. I will serve you. May I know the name of my new lord? She asked him, devotion beginning to sprout in her voice. To her such was only the right course of action. As a demon she respected the strong. This man was certainly strong, strong enough that she knew he could kill her where she stood, should he wish it. In such an event it wouldn't matter whether she swore her allegiance to him now or not. She remembered how Rouge subjected Blue and Vert. Besides, she was more than happy to serve one who was strong enough, and see what they would bring into the world with that might. My name is Lucian Silver, and I am glad to welcome you into my service. Here, as a gift for doing so, Lucian introduced himself properly before taking out a spare vessel that Kaijin had made for him so long ago. Blanc accepted the gift and inhabited the new body, once doing so not changing much at all in appearance. She then bowed before him once the process was done, and Lucian considered her as she thanked him for the gift. He looked at her and thought back onto what he thought when he first saw her, and made his decision then. Now, all in my service have names, and you shall be no different. As such, I name you from this day onward Emma Swan, he decreed, and saw the primordial's eyes widen before being consumed in light. Lucian was quite happy with how this went. After all, he now had someone skilled in logistics to aid him in his endeavors. One that had been perfecting such skills for thousands and thousands of years at that. Lucian brought the now named Emma back to camp and introduced her to the others after calling for them. So the main group that Lucian had assembled with the exception of Blake got introduced to the primordial and told of her status. The reactions were an interesting thing for him to watch, to be honest. Alice looked at the white-haired lady with curiosity and asked about her magical knowledge. When Emma showed off her freezing white flames, Alice was quite intrigued. After a few moments of studying the magic, the black-haired witch casted them herself, and got busy trying to see how good her copy was. The ancestor of all white demons looked shocked at the ease at which the young demon was able to recreate her signature magic, that too with but a quick look. Lucian's explanation about Alice's unique skill didn't diminish how impressed the woman was at all either. Alfred, on the other hand, just asked if they could spar some time, more excited about the idea of fighting such an ancient being than anything else. Alex meanwhile looked like they wanted to cry at being told that she would be taking over the logistical duties now. Massive relief to the spider demon, no longer needing to be front and center anymore and able to retreat to their beloved shadows. Surtur didn't really seem to care much, in part due to them not really understanding the significance of what she was. The others, though, had more intense reactions. Harley and Ivy knew about demons, and typically the older they were, the more evil and powerful they were. So for Lucian to have basically tamed one was a massive surprise. The fact that he said that Emma's age was since roughly the dawn of time did not help in the slightest. The two also knew that such things worked a bit differently here, and decided to just keep an eye on the woman for now in case of any funny business. Bullet, on the other hand, looked like he was about to start swinging his sword after seeing her at first. After Lucian asked the man what was wrong, he soon put things together why he had such a. Apparently Emma reminded him of his death, the icy general from his home world that was known for her cruelty and icy demeanor. Emma did give off the vibes of an ice queen, as if she brought the cold with her wherever she stepped, so he could understand Bullet getting a similar vibe from her. The fact that his death as soldiers were who almost killed him didn't help in the least. Honestly though, Lucian didn't know Bullet had ever met the woman, but apparently before he left the army he'd meet the woman in passing, and it was enough to leave an impression. Shirzwa was wary as well, though his seemed more instinctual than anything. Lucian thought that maybe his experience being around a supernatural being like Kelty may have sharpened his senses to such things. The fact that Emma's aura was slightly tinged with death from her nature of being from hell likely aided in that. But he seemed more or less fine with it all, not having any real opinion at the new arrival. Kushina was worried from the vibe Emma gave off as well, in her own words feeling like the most death-soaked killer I have ever met. When Lucian remembered the Lakeshore dyed Scarlet incident, that made quite a bit of sense to him. So he reassured her that he had things in hand, and not to worry for now. Historia though seemed to just want to make a new friend, and got a smile out of the ice. It was Aries' reaction that was equal parts adorable and surprising. "Are you?" the little girl had asked, having never seen someone with white hair and red eyes like hers before. Emma had knelt down to be eye level with the little one before patting her on the head. "I guess we do look alike. Do you want to be friends then, little one?" she asked Ari, getting a nod before she ran back behind Harley. They all chuckled at the scene, and Lucian was reminded of something he'd been meaning to so, taking the moment of reprieve he asked Puriel what he wished to know. "Puriel, what are Ari's skills if she has any?" He asked the skill, and the answer left him shook. The individual Aerie has the following skills: pain resistance, magic sense, self-regeneration, and reversion. Reversion is an intrinsic skill that allows her to passively absorb temporal energy that she can then later use to reverse the local flow of time. For this target can be biological or non-biological. There are no restrictions. Skill also includes the subskills temporal attack resistance, self-regulation, time manipulation, temporal energy accumulation, and energy storage. There does not appear to be any limit to how much energy can be stored, Puriel told him after a moment. Lucian was shocked despite knowing about Aerie's quirk for one reason. She now had control over it and was immune to time attacks. That was huge, in many ways in fact. It made him wonder what would happen should someone try and use stopped world on her. Thoughts like that and the realization that Puriel could copy such a thing that made him break out into laughter even more. Looks like I found my counter to the time bullshit everyone spams. He thought to himself at that, the fact that he may have found a counter to one of the most dangerous techniques in this world from a child being far too funny to him. Edited, February 7, 2026. Chapter End Notes: I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.